The rope bit into Kaelen's raw palms, each twist of hemp a fresh agony against skin worn thin by rock and relentless cold. Below him, the world had dissolved into a churning sea of grey mist, a formless abyss that had swallowed the valley floor days ago. Above, the granite spire of Aethelgard's tooth clawed at a sky the colour of tarnished pewter. There was no sun, only a diffuse, chilling light that seemed to emanate from the clouds themselves. He was a fly clinging to the spine of a dead god, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the rasp of his own breathing and the mournful sigh of the wind as it navigated the jagged peaks of the Dragon's Teeth range. He risked a glance downwards, not at the drop, but at the leather satchel secured tightly to his hip. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the map. It wasn't a map of any kingdom known to man. It was a map of a single mountain. A fever dream of contour lines and cryptic annotations inked in his father's spidery, increasingly frantic hand. The Vein of Sorrows read one note next to a treacherous-looking ice field. I hear the wind speaks with dead men's tongues. Marked another beside a narrow exposed ridge, and at the very heart of the mountain, a crude drawing of a multifaceted gem, labelled with a single desperate word, cure. A tremor, sharp and unwelcome, shot up his left arm. It started in his fingertips, a pins and needles sensation that was no longer just from the cold. He gritted his teeth, pressing his hand flat against the freezing rock until the shaking subsided. He didn't need to pull back the stained leather of his glove to know what was happening. He could feel it, the slow, inexorable march of the Grey Blight, the creeping petrification that had claimed his grandfather's legs, his father's hands, and was now beginning its cold conquest of his own flesh. It started with a numbness, a loss of sensation. Then the skin would take on a pebbled texture, like fine-grained stone. Over months or years, if you were lucky, it hardened, thickened, until muscle and bone were fused into an inert grey mass. His father had called it the Stone Sleep, a gentler name for a terrifyingly slow demise. Kaelen remembered his father in his final year. A living statue from the chest down, his brilliant cartographer's mind trapped in a prison of his own making. His eyes the only part of him that could still convey the horror. That memory was the fuel that burned away the cold, the pain, the exhaustion. He found a secure handhold, tested it with his full weight, and continued his ascent. According to his father's map, the entrance wasn't a grand cave or a gaping maw. It was a fissure, a breadth of the mountain, hidden behind a curtain of petrified scree on a ledge that shouldn't exist. For 3 days, he had been searching for that ledge along the sheer western face. A vertical climb that would have made a seasoned mountaineer balk. But Kaelen was a cartographer. He didn't see an impassable cliff. He saw fracture lines, erosion patterns, subtle shifts in the rock strata. He read the mountain like a text, and his father's notes were the key. Finally, he saw it. A dark horizontal line, barely a meter high, running for a dozen paces across the cliff face. It was exactly where the map indicated, a geological anomaly that looked like a scar left by a giant's blade. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar warmth, bloomed in his chest. He hauled himself over the lip of the ledge, his boots scraping for purchase. He lay panting for a full minute, the granite cold seeping through his worn tunic, the mist coiling around him like curious serpents. The ledge was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men to stand abreast, and it sloped unnervingly towards the precipice. At the far end, a cascade of shale and broken rock, frozen in place by millennia of ice and wind, formed a grey curtain. The entrance had to be behind it. He crawled on hands and knees, the stone chewing at his trousers. As he drew closer, he could feel a faint vibration through the rock, a low, resonant hum that was less a sound and more a pressure against his bones. A strange draught, smelling of deep earth, ozone, and something else. Something metallic and ancient snaked out from between the frozen stones. This was it. The air here was different, colder, yet charged with a strange energy that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He used his climbing axe to pry away the first few pieces of scree. They came away with a grating screech, revealing a sliver of absolute darkness. He worked methodically, his earlier exhaustion forgotten, adrenaline singing in his veins. The opening widened. Soon it was large enough to squeeze through. He lit his oil lamp, the small flame sputtering in the strange draught, casting flickering shadows that danced like devils on the rock. He took a deep breath, untied the rope from his waist, and pushed his satchel and pack through the opening before wriggling in after them. The transition was instantaneous and profound. The wind died. The oppressive grey light vanished. He was in a perfectly silent, perfectly black tunnel. The only light and sound coming from his own lamp and his own harsh breathing. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay and dormant power. The hum was stronger in here, a bass thrum that resonated in his teeth. The floor of the tunnel was unnaturally smooth, sloping gently downwards into the mountain's core. It wasn't a natural cave. The walls were too regular, the angles too precise, as if bored by some impossible machine or carved by hands that considered granite no more troublesome than clay. Kaelen held the lamp high. Strange faint lines were carved into the walls, geometric patterns that interlocked and spiraled in ways that made his head ache. They weren't dwarven runes or elven script. They were older, more fundamental. As he walked, his boots echoing in the immense quiet, he noticed a faint luminescence beginning to emanate from the patterns on the wall, a sickly green-silver light, like phosphorescence on a rotting log. It grew brighter the deeper he went, until he no longer needed his lamp. He extinguished it to conserve oil, and walked on through the eerie, self-illuminating corridor. The grey blight in his hand began to ache. Not the familiar numbness, but a deep, throbbing pain, as if the stone within him were resonating with the hum of the mountain. He clutched his arm, his knuckles white. Was this a good sign? Was the curse reacting to its antithesis? Or was he marching into the very source of the affliction, hastening his own end? His father's notes had been unclear, a mix of scholarly observation and the ravings of a man running out of time. The heart pulses with the paradox of creation and ruin. One passage read, "It is the blood that fed the blight, and the only balm that can wash it away." The tunnel opened abruptly into a cavern so vast that the green glowing walls were lost in the distance. The ceiling was a canopy of shadow, from which hung colossal stalactites like the teeth in a leviathan's jaw. The hum was a palpable force here, a physical presence that vibrated through the soles of his boots. And in the center of the cavern, across a chasm spanned by a narrow natural bridge of rock, he saw it. It wasn't a gem, not in any sense he understood. Suspended in the air, held by nothing, was a floating island of crystalline rock, perhaps 50 paces across, and at its heart, embedded within the crystal, was the source of the hum, the source of the legend. It was a light, a slow, rhythmic pulse of crimson light that illuminated the entire cavern in waves of blood and shadow. It beat like a living thing, a heart of impossible size, the lifeblood of a dead god, still beating in the dark. Kaelen stared, his breath caught in his throat. the aching in his arm intensifying with every pulse. He was here. He had found the curse of the Titan's heart. Now he just had to reach it. The bridge was a spine of black, unforgiving rock, a natural arch that seemed too fragile to bear the weight of a single man, let alone the ages. It stretched across the chasm with a stark and brutal simplicity. Kaelen took a step onto it, his boot grating on the stone. The surface was slick with a thin, almost invisible film of moisture that condensed out of the supercharged air with every pulse of the heart. With the first crimson wave of light that washed over him, the chasm below was illuminated. Kaelen's stomach lurched and he froze, his hand flying to the rock wall beside him for support. The abyss wasn't empty. It was a forest of grey statues, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, stretching down into the oppressive darkness beyond the light's reach. They were figures of men, women, and creatures he couldn't name, all frozen in attitudes of despair. Some were reaching upwards, their stone fingers crooked into claws of supplication. Others were curled into balls, faces hidden. A few stood defiant, weapons raised against an unseen foe. They were all victims of the Grey Blight. He could see the same pebbled texture on their skin, the same lifeless hue that was beginning to colonize his own hand. This wasn't just the source of the cure. It was a graveyard, a silent, petrified testament to the curse's long and merciless reign. Had they all come here seeking the same salvation, only to be consumed by the mountain's malevolent influence? The ache in his arm sharpened into a piercing agony, a hot spear of pain that lanced from his fingertips to his shoulder, perfectly in sync with the heart's crimson pulse. He cried out, a thin, sharp sound that was swallowed by the cavern's immensity. He staggered, his vision swimming in a red haze. The hum of the mountain seemed to focus inside his head, a deafening drone that threatened to shake his teeth from their sockets. He looked at his gloved hand and saw, to his horror, that the leather was beginning to stiffen, the fingers curling slightly into a claw against his will. The proximity to the heart was accelerating the process. His father's warning, scrawled in the margin of the map, screamed in his mind. To approach the source is to invite its full embrace. Fear, cold and absolute, threatened to paralyze him. It would be so easy to turn back, to flee the thrumming, blood-lit heart of this cursed mountain. But to where? Back to a world where he would slowly turn to stone, a living monument to his own failure. He thought of his father's eyes, the last bastion of a brilliant mind trapped in a granite shell. That image was a harsher torment than any physical pain. He gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw bunching. The pain was a part of him now. He would either master it, or it would be his tombstone. He took another step, then another, forcing himself into a slow, deliberate rhythm. He kept his eyes fixed on the crystalline island ahead, on the shimmering goal, refusing to look down into the petrified despair of the chasm. The bridge was longer than it looked. With each step, the air grew thicker, heavier, crackling with a static charge that lifted the fine hairs on his arms. The crimson light felt like a physical weight, pressing down on him, while the intervening moments of shadow were so complete, he felt he might step off into nothingness. The hum was no longer just in his bones. It was the only reality, a vibration that defined the very existence of this place. He was halfway across when a tremor shook the bridge. It was not a natural quake. It was a resonant shudder, a response to a particularly powerful pulse from the heart. A shower of small pebbles skittered from the underside of the arch, their clicks and rattles echoing as they vanished into the depths. Kaelen flattened himself against the stone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waited, breath held, until the vibration subsided. His cursed arm was now a single throbbing monument to pain. But beneath the agony, he felt something else. A strange and terrible connection. He could almost feel the flow of energy from the heart, sense its ancient alien consciousness. It wasn't evil, not in a way a man could understand. It simply was. A force of nature as implacable and indifferent as a glacier or a star. Finally, his outstretched hand touched not rock, but something else. It was smooth, cool, and vibrated with a purer, higher frequency than the stone of the bridge. Crystal. He had made it. He dragged himself the last few feet, collapsing onto the shore of the floating island. He lay there for a long time, chest heaving, listening to the frantic drumming of his own blood. The ground beneath him was a mosaic of interlocking crystalline facets, some as clear as ice, others milky and opaque. The eerie green-silver light he had seen in the tunnels emanated from the seams between them, tracing a complex web of geometric patterns across the entire island. When he had gathered his strength, he pushed himself to his knees. He was here. The heart was only 30 paces away. It hung in the air at the island's center. A core of incandescent red light, shrouded in a swirling mist of crimson energy. But as he looked closer, his cartographer's eye picking out the details, his hope faltered. It wasn't simply floating there unprotected. A barrier surrounded it. The same spiraling, interlocking geometric patterns that were etched into the island's floor. And the tunnel walls were manifest here as a three-dimensional cage of pure green-silver light. It was a sphere of shifting, intricate lines, a lattice of energy that constantly reconfigured itself, its complexity dizzying to behold. It was beautiful, ancient, and utterly impassable. He staggered closer, one hand clutching his throbbing arm. As he neared the barrier, the hum intensified, and a low, musical tone detached itself from the drone, a clear note of warning. He reached out a hand, his good hand, and stopped a foot from the shimmering lines. The air was a wall of pressure pushing back against him. He knew without a doubt that to touch it would be to be unmade. This was the final lock, the mountain's last defense. He slumped down, his back against a low crystal outcrop. Defeated, he had climbed the impossible peak, found the hidden path, crossed the chasm of the dead, only to be thwarted by a puzzle of light. There was no brute force solution here. No axe or rope would be of any use. He fumbled at his hip and pulled out the leather satchel. His fingers, clumsy with cold and pain, unwrapped the oilcloth. The map, his father's last testament, lay open on his lap. The crimson light of the heart fell upon the vellum, making the black ink stand out in stark relief. He stared at the central drawing, the crude, multifaceted gem his father had labeled Cure. Around it in the margins were dozens of smaller, frantic sketches. They were patterns, geometric forms, interlocking lines, spirals, the very same designs that formed the luminous cage before him. His father hadn't just been mapping a location, he had been trying to solve the lock. A sudden insight, sharp and clear as the crystal beneath him, cut through his pain and exhaustion. He looked from the map to the cage and back again. The patterns weren't random. They were a sequence, a language, and his father, in his final desperate days, had been trying to translate it. Though the heart pulses with the paradox of creation and ruin. It wasn't just a philosophical musing. It was a clue. He looked at his afflicted arm. The pain was still immense, but it was no longer just a chaotic agony. It had a rhythm, a cadence, a beat that matched the pulsing of the heart. And as he focused on a specific pattern on the map, and then found its counterpart in the shifting lattice of light. The pain in his arm changed. The sharp stabbing sensation lessened, replaced by a deep, resonant ache. When his eyes drifted to a different, more complex pattern, the searing pain returned. He gasped. It was a guide. The curse itself, the very affliction he sought to destroy, was resonating with the lock. The blight in his flesh was a key. A compass needle of pain that could point the way. His father must have realized it too. But he was too far gone, his hands already stone, unable to complete the work. Kaelen was not just his father's heir. He was his last living instrument. He spread the map out fully, the fragile vellum trembling in his shaking hands, and began to trace the first of his father's symbols. His gaze fixed on the shimmering, impossible cage. The long night of the Titan's heart had just begun. He began with the simplest design, a triangle with an inscribed spiral, a shape his father had circled multiple times. It was a foundational form that appeared as a minor repeating element in the cage's chaotic dance. Following his intuition, he focused not on the cage itself, but inward, on the agony in his arm. He had spent his life pushing pain away, building walls against it. Now he had to invite it in, to listen to its terrible song. He closed his eyes, the crimson pulse of the heart painting the inside of his eyelids. He ignored the vast hum of the cavern and sought the specific sharp frequency of his own affliction. It was there, a dissonant chord in the mountain symphony. He held the image of the spiral in the triangle in his mind, trying to impose its order on the chaos of his pain. A mistake. The pain flared white-hot, a shriek of agony that made him gasp, his teeth grinding together. The cage of light before him flickered violently, its pattern scrambling as if in agitation. Failure. Brute mental force was not the answer. He opened his eyes, sweat stinging them, his breath coming in ragged pants. His father's notes. He scanned the vellum again, his gaze catching on a word scrawled beside the very same diagram. Resonance. Of course. A cartographer thought in terms of lines and shapes, but his father had been a scholar too. He understood principles. Kaelen wasn't meant to force a key into a lock. He was meant to match the key's unique vibration until the lock accepted it as part of itself. He took a deep, shuddering breath and tried again. This time, he didn't try to silence or reshape the pain. He let it be. He listened to its rhythm, its pitch. He let the thrumming in his petrifying flesh become his guide. Then, holding the shape of the triangle and spiral in his mind, he began to subtly alter his focus, not forcing the pattern, but searching for the mental and spiritual note that would make the pain in his arm align with the visual pattern on the cage. It was like tuning a lute string in the heart of a hurricane. He pushed his concentration past a dozen different points of screaming agony, each one a wrong note that threatened to break his will. The curse fought him, its nature being chaos and decay, while the lock demanded perfect, unwavering order. And then he found it, a subtle shift. The searing pain did not vanish, but its quality changed. The jagged, tearing sensation smoothed out into a pure, powerful vibration, still painful, but clean, like a perfectly struck bell. A wave of vertigo washed over him. He felt a connection form, a conduit opening between the blight in his arm and the cage of light. Through him the paradox was being bridged. He opened his eyes. All across the shimmering sphere, every instance of the spiral in the triangle pattern had ceased its restless movement. They glowed with a steady, brilliant white light, no longer the sickly green-silver. The cage as a whole seemed a fraction less complex, a fraction more stable. A single, clear harmonic note now sang out from the barrier, a counterpoint to the heart's oppressive bass hum. A wave of profound exhaustion, bone-deep and immediate, crashed over him. He slumped against the crystal, the connection broken. The pure vibration in his arm dissolved back into the familiar ugly ache. But it was muted now, as if cowed. He had succeeded. He had taken the first step. He risked pulling back the stiff, stained leather of his glove. The sight stole his breath. The pebbled grey texture of the blight had advanced. Before, it had been a creeping tide at the base of his fingers. Now, it had consumed his knuckles and was marching inexorably across the back of his hand. The act of using the curse as a key was feeding it, drawing its power to the surface. Each piece of the puzzle he solved would cost him a piece of himself. This wasn't just a race against time. It was a race against a finish line that moved closer with every step he took. A sudden jarring image flashed behind his eyes. Not a memory, but an imposition. He saw a landscape under a sky of bruised purple, lit by two alien suns. One gold, one white. A mountain, far grander than Aethelgard's tooth, was being torn asunder not by erosion, but by a sound, a cataclysmic chord of creation. He saw a being of immense scale, its form indistinct, part living stone, part pure light, reaching into the mountain's core and pulling forth a bleeding star, the heart. Then the vision shattered, leaving him dizzy and nauseous, the alien sky burning in his after-image. He understood. The heart wasn't from this world. It was the source of the blight, because it was fundamentally incompatible with this reality. Its life-giving energy a poison to the lands and people it touched. The cage was not a prison, but a quarantine. A complex mechanism designed by some long-vanished intelligence to contain the heart's catastrophic influence. He wasn't breaking into a treasure vault. He was trying to open a plague casket. His father's words echoed again. The blood that fed the blight, and the only balm that can wash it away. The paradox was deeper than he could have imagined. To be cured, he needed a dose of the very poison that was killing him. But a pure, unfiltered dose, taken directly from the source, a single drop of the heart's true essence, before its power was corrupted by the world around it. A cold certainty settled in his gut. There would be no walking away from this. Either he solved the puzzle and claimed the cure, or the blight would consume him right here, and he would join the silent forest of statues in the chasm below. There was no middle ground, no retreat. Steeling himself, he pushed the terrifying revelation aside and focused on the task. He looked back at the map. His father had numbered the diagrams, creating a potential sequence. The next symbol was a far more complex shape, a hexagon containing a series of nested, asymmetrical chevrons. It appeared less frequently in the cage's lattice, and its movements were more erratic. This would be harder. The cost would be greater. He repositioned himself, leaning his back against the cool, humming crystal, and once more closed his eyes. He reached for the pane, his new and terrible instrument, and began to search for the next note in the mountain's ancient, deadly song. He found the new frequency faster this time, his mind learning the strange calculus of pain and pattern. He felt the connection snap into place, a jolt of energy that made his teeth ache. The corresponding hexagonal patterns on the cage flared white and locked into place. The harmonic overtone grew richer, the cage visibly simplifying, but the backlash was severe. The petrification surged up his wrist, a cold, tight band of pressure. He could feel the flesh beneath his sleeve stiffening, the fine bones of his wrist beginning to fuse. A strangled cry escaped his lips. He fought the rising panic, the claustrophobic terror of being trapped inside his own body. He had to keep going. To stop now was to die. He worked for hours, losing all track of time, marked only by the rhythmic pulse of the heart. He moved through his father's diagrams one by one, a pattern of interlocking circles, a star with too many points, a shape that seemed to defy Euclidean geometry, hurting his eyes to even look at it on the page. Each successful resonance locked another piece of the cage into place, simplifying the whole and adding another note to the growing celestial choir that pushed back against the heart's drone. And each success cost him dearly. The blight crept past his wrist, then halfway to his elbow. His left arm was becoming a dead weight, a club of stone he had to drag with him. The pain of the resonance process was immense, but it was the aftermath that was truly terrifying. The cold, silent advance of the Grey Blight, a creeping tide of oblivion. With each new pattern, a new fleeting vision assaulted him. Cities of crystal shattering into dust, oceans of black sand boiling under strange constellations, silent, terrified faces of a race long since turned to myth. He was interfacing with the heart's memory, the long, lonely, and terrible history of its cosmic journey. Finally, only one symbol remained on his father's map. It was the largest, the most complex, a master key that incorporated elements of all the previous patterns. It was the centerpiece of the cage's design, a swirling vortex of lines and angles that still moved with fluid, chaotic grace. His father had not circled this one. He had drawn a question mark beside it, his hand shaky, desperate. This was as far as he had gotten in his theoretical work before the blight claimed his mind and hands. Kaelen's left arm was stone nearly to his shoulder. It was heavy, numb, and achingly cold. The pain he used as a guide was now a remote sensation, a phantom limb of agony from a part of him that was no longer truly his. He was exhausted, his mind frayed from the visions and the intense concentration. He knew with a chilling finality that this was his last chance. Whether he succeeded or failed, he did not have the strength or the flesh left for another attempt. This would either open the way or be the act that completed his transformation into one of the statues he'd seen in the abyss. He took one last look at his father's frantic script, drew a breath that felt like swallowing powdered glass, and reached out with his mind for the final, terrible resonance. The final pattern was not a shape. It was a motion, a cascade of logic. Kaelen realized his father's question mark wasn't one of confusion, but of definition. The symbol wasn't a static lock, but the living equation that governed the entire mechanism. To solve it, he couldn't just find a single resonant frequency. He had to become the choir. He pushed himself away from the crystal outcrop, planting his feet on the humming floor. His right hand, trembling with fatigue, rested on the cold, unyielding stone of his left shoulder. He took a breath and plunged his consciousness into the storm. It was a symphony of torment. He had to hold the clean, bell-like tone of the first resonance, the deeper harmonic of the second, the jarring but stable chord of the third, all while his mind raced to trace the fluid, ever-changing lines of the master pattern. The pain was no longer a guide. It was a roaring, deafening sea, a high, keening note of tearing muscle fought with a grinding bass of bone turning to stone. The phantom sensations from his petrified arm screamed with a dozen different agonies at once. His vision dissolved into a swirling vortex of crimson light and fractured after images of the alien worlds he had witnessed. He was losing himself. His identity as Kaelen, the cartographer, the sun, was being ground away between the millstones of the curse and the lock. He was becoming a living bridge, a conduit of paradoxical energies, and the strain was annihilating him. The blight, no longer content with its creeping advance, surged. He felt a spiderweb of icy cold spread from his stone shoulder across his chest, a lattice of petrification taking root in his ribs, inching towards his own beating heart. This was it, the final cost. Just as his consciousness began to fray, a single clear thought cut through the noise. A memory of his father's voice, lecturing him as a boy over a half-finished map. Don't just draw the lines, Kaelen. Understand the space between them. That is where the truth of the landscape lies. The space between, not the notes but the silence, not the patterns but the voids they created. With a final desperate act of will, Kaelen shifted his focus. He stopped trying to hold the chaotic symphony together and instead poured his entire being into the negative space, the silent architecture that contained the cage's logic. For a heartbeat, there was nothing, and then everything clicked into place. The cage did not shatter or explode. The lines of light did not vanish. They bled into one another, their sharp, geometric forms softening into flowing rivers of energy. The complex, discordant choir of harmonics resolved into a single universe-spanning chord of profound and perfect peace. The entire sphere of light seemed to sigh, folding inward like a celestial flower closing in reverse. The patterns converged on a single point of silent white brilliance and were gone. The oppressive hum of the cavern vanished. The thrumming in Kaelen's bones ceased. In the sudden, absolute silence, the only sound was the frantic, panicked beat of his own heart. The quarantine was broken. The raw power of the Titan's heart, unfiltered and untamed, washed over him. It was not just light and heat. It was pure information, pure existence. 1 billion years of cosmic loneliness, of worlds witnessed and forgotten, crashed into his mind. The crimson light was no longer menacing. It was achingly beautiful, a color more vibrant than anything in his world. The heart itself, now fully visible, was a liquid swirling mass of this impossible red, a captured nebula twisting around a core of utter blackness. The pain in his body was gone, not eased, not muted, gone. He looked down at his left arm in disbelief. It was still stone, a grey sculpted appendage fused to his side. The blight that had been creeping across his chest had halted, its advance frozen solid. The curse was no longer active, but the damage was done. The silence was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped. He staggered forward, his body screaming with exhaustion. The cure. His father's words, a balm to wash it away. He reached out his good hand, not towards the swirling heart itself, but towards the air around it, where droplets of crimson energy condensed and fell like slow-motion rain, sizzling into nothingness as they touched the crystal floor. He only needed a single drop. As his fingers neared the shimmering veil of energy, the island lurched. It was not a tremor from the mountain, but a convulsion from within the crystal itself. Kaelen fell to his knees, his stone arms striking the ground with a dull crack. Before him, the multifaceted floor began to move. Facets of the island floor shifted, grinding against one another, rising up like broken teeth. A form rose from the crystalline matrix, not built, but grown, assembling itself from the very substance of the floating island. It was a humanoid silhouette of translucent crystal and captured starlight, easily twice Kaelen's height. It had no discernible features, its face a smooth, contemplative plane, featureless save for 2 points of cold silver light that burned like distant dying stars. It was not alive in any way Kaelen understood, but it was aware. A low, resonant voice, like the grinding of glaciers, echoed not in the air, but directly inside his skull. The crystalline being, the Guardian, took a step. The sound was of a mountain cracking, its silver eyes fixed on Kaelen, not with malice, but with an unnerving, absolute purpose. Kaelen scrambled backwards, his mind reeling. This was part of the lock, the final defense. A warden, dormant for millennia, awakened by the breaking of its cage. I mean no harm. Kaelen croaked, his voice raw. I need a cure. The Guardian tilted its head, a slow geological movement. Its voice was devoid of emotion, a pure transmission of intent. With its decay state radiation, you are a vector. You must be sterilized. It raised a hand, and the crystal of its arm reformed, sharpening into a blade that seemed to cut the light itself. Kaelen's hope, so briefly and brilliantly kindled, turned to cold, black ash. He had survived the mountain, the chasm, the curse's acceleration, and the puzzle of the ancients, only to be judged a contamination and sentenced to execution by the jailer. He was trapped. Behind him, the fragile bridge back to the rest of the mountain. Before him, an ancient crystalline automaton armed with a blade of light, and beside him, the swirling silent cosmic power that had caused it all. He was half stone disarmed and minutes from complete collapse. The Guardian took another step. Kaelen pushed himself up with his good arm, his mind racing. He couldn't fight it. He couldn't run. He looked at the heart, the source of his doom and his only possible salvation. It pulsed gently, its raw energy no longer a violent assault, but a steady, almost curious presence. It had been caged for eons, silent and alone. Now it was free, and it was aware of him. He felt a faint, inquisitive touch in his mind, a whisper of alien thought that was nothing like the Guardian's cold logic. It was a question, an offering. The heart, the source of the paradox, was presenting him with a choice. He could die here, sterilized by the Guardian, his quest ending in absolute failure. Or he could embrace the paradox completely. He could invite the poison in, not as a cure, but as a transformation. The Guardian raised its crystalline blade. The silver points of its eyes narrowed, preparing to strike. Kaelen had no time left. He turned his back on the automaton, and with the last of his strength, plunged his good hand directly into the swirling, incandescent energy of the Titan's heart. There was no heat, no cold. There was only dissolution. The moment his fingers breached the veil of crimson light, the concept of his own body, of skin and bone and blood, became a quaint and distant memory. His consciousness was a single grain of sand thrown into a supernova. He was not Kaelen anymore. He was a nerve ending for a god. A billion years of silent, cold travel through the void flooded his mind. He saw the birth of stars as fleeting sparks and the death of galaxies as the slow closing of an eye. He felt the crushing gravity of dead worlds and the formless drift of nebulae. He experienced a loneliness so profound, so absolute, it was a physical force, an axiom of the universe. This was the heart's memory, its soul, and it was pouring into him, scouring his own small, brief life from the slate of his mind. The Guardian's blade fell, the crystalline edge, sharp enough to sever the bonds between atoms, sliced through the air with a sound like tearing silk. It struck Kaelen's back, right where the creeping blight had been taking hold across his ribs. But it did not cut flesh. The blade hit the petrified portion of his torso with a deafening, resonant clang, the sound of a hammer striking an anvil the size of a mountain. A spiderweb of incandescent red cracks erupted across the Guardian's arm, and the blade itself, a weapon of impossible integrity, shattered into 1,000 shards of glittering dust. The Guardian recoiled, its silver-light eyes flaring with what could only be described as computational shock. Kaelen was oblivious. He was drowning in a sea of stars, his physical form a forgotten vessel. The raw energy of the heart, having found a conduit, now turned its attention inward, to the alien cancer that had preceded it. It met the Grey Blight not as an enemy, but as a long-lost, corrupted echo of itself. The Blight was the heart's energy, decayed and twisted by its interaction with a foreign reality. Now the source was reclaiming its own. An agony beyond all reckoning ripped through him. He felt the stone in his arm and chest fracture, not from an external blow, but from an internal explosion of light. The grey, lifeless rock cracked open, and from within those fissures poured the same liquid crimson energy that comprised the heart. It was not washing the stone away. It was using it as a crucible, reforging it. The pebbled, dead texture of the blight began to shift, to smooth out, to take on a faint luster. The grey lightened, swirling with veins of deep, obsidian black and shimmering threads of captured starlight. His arm was no longer stone. It was becoming something else. A new substance born of the fusion of two worlds. The pain was the fire of a forge, burning away his humanity. He felt his own DNA being unwritten and rewritten, his cells screaming as they were either annihilated or forced to adapt to a new, impossible biology. He could feel the heart's energy surging through his bloodstream, bonding with his marrow, overwriting the very essence of what made him human. His right hand, still plunged in the heart's core, was changing too, not into the dark, star-shot crystal of his left side, but into something purer. The flesh became translucent, his bones glowing with a soft internal light. His veins were no longer filled with blood, but with slow-moving rivers of crimson energy. He was becoming a living paradox, one half a creature of stone and starlight, the other a being of pure, contained energy. The Guardian's voice boomed in his skull, pulling his fractured consciousness partially back to the cavern. Integrating, becoming primary host. New directive, contain the host, sever the connection. The Guardian's shattered arm reformed, not into a blade, but into a blunt, heavy cudgel of crystal. It raised the weapon, preparing to pulp the connection, to smash Kaelen's arm and torso into rubble, separating him from the heart by brute force. But Kaelen was no longer just a man. The inquisitive touch he had felt from the heart was now a voice in his head, not of words, but of pure intent. It was ancient, vast, and for the first time in millennia, it was not alone. It showed him the Guardian not as a monster, but as a machine, a function. It showed him the energy flows that animated it, the control matrix that governed it, the protocols that bound it, and it showed him how to break them. As the Guardian swung its massive club, Kaelen moved. It was not a conscious decision. His newly formed left arm, the arm of star-shot crystal, lifted of its own accord. It was impossibly heavy, yet it moved with a fluid grace that defied its mass. He did not block the blow. He met it. His crystalline fingers, now tipped with razor-sharp obsidian, slid between the shifting facets of the Guardian's arm. He did not push or pull. He simply willed it. he introduced a single discordant frequency into the Guardian's energy matrix, a sliver of the cosmic chaos he now contained. The Guardian froze mid-swing. Its silver eyes flickered erratically. The crystal of its body glowed and dimmed, its internal light struggling against a foreign command. Cascade, failure, protocol contradiction, cannot contain, source, within, host. With a final grating screech of stressed crystal, the Guardian's light went out. It stood for a moment, a lifeless immense statue of clear unlit quartz, before its own structural integrity failed. It did not crumble. It simply came apart, its constituent pieces disassociating and clattering to the floor in a heap of inert, perfect crystals. The Warden was deactivated. The sudden silence was absolute. Kaelen fell to his knees, his connection to the heart still a torrent of fire in his soul. He finally managed to pull his right hand free. The rivers of crimson light in his arm slowed, the intense glow subsiding to a warm, steady pulse that matched his own terrified heartbeat. He looked at his hands, his new hands. The right, a map of glowing veins beneath translucent skin. The left, a beautiful, terrible thing of polished black crystal, heavy and cold and utterly alien. He could feel the weight of it, but he could also feel every vibration in the island through its strange new substance. The blight was gone. The stone was gone. But he was not cured. He was claimed. He was a cartographer. He read the world through its lines and structures. And now he could see the lines of the universe itself, etched into his own flesh. The curse hadn't been lifted. It had been fulfilled. He was no longer a man dying of the Grey Blight. He was a living vessel for the Titan's heart, a walking, breathing paradox of creation and ruin. The cold loneliness of the heart was now his own, a constant companion in the back of his mind. He had come to the mountain seeking to save his life, and had instead lost it, trading a slow, quiet death for a terrifying, unknown existence. He had his cure, but the price was his humanity. The silence was a physical weight, heavier than the eons of rock above him. For his entire time in the mountain's core, the hum had been his constant companion, a vibration that had defined reality. Its absence left a void, a ringing deafness in the soul. Kaelen pushed himself slowly to his feet, a graceless, shuddering movement. His body was a stranger to him, a poorly balanced collection of mismatched parts. The crystalline left side of his body was an anchor, a solid, immense weight that pulled him constantly off balance. He had to consciously brace his right leg to keep from toppling over. His left arm, the arm of star-shot obsidian, hung at his side like a sculptor's abandoned masterpiece. Beautiful, alien, and inert, unless he commanded it with a specific, focused thought. In contrast, his right side felt unnervingly light, almost ethereal. The skin of his right arm and hand was a softly glowing palimpsest, the translucent flesh revealing the slow, ceaseless river of crimson light that had replaced his blood. When he clenched his right fist, the light within it brightened, and he felt not the strain of muscle, but the gathering of a potent, unfamiliar energy. He stumbled across the crystalline floor, his boots scuffing against the inert facets that had once been the Guardian. He stopped before a large polished shard, angled so that it caught the faint ambient glow from his own body. In it, he saw his reflection. He saw a monster. His face was bisected. The left side was Kaelen's, pale and strained, his brown eye wide with a familiar human terror. But the right side? The skin there was stretched taut and semi-translucent over his skull, and the eye on that side was no longer brown. It was a solid orb of soft crimson light, pupilless and profound. A faint tracery of glowing veins, like red lightning frozen under glass, spread from his temple down his neck, disappearing beneath the collar of his tunic. The blight was gone, yes. In its place was something far more terrifying. He was a living border, a walking map between two irreconcilable worlds. The sheer cosmic loneliness he had inherited from the heart washed over him, a cold tide that threatened to drown his own identity. He was a singular being in the history of the world, and the thought brought him no pride, only a desolate, crushing isolation. He reached up with his glowing right hand, the fingers hesitating a hair's breadth from his face. He could feel the energy radiating from his own skin, a warmth that was not the warmth of life, but of some stellar process. He snatched his hand back as if burned. He had to leave. The thought was a lifeline in his sea of shock. He turned and saw his discarded satchel lying near the edge of the island. He lurched towards it, his gait a clumsy, limping shuffle, as he learned the new physics of his own body. He knelt, his new left arm striking the crystal floor with a solid thud. He fumbled with the clasp with his right hand. The map was still there, the vellum seeming impossibly fragile and mundane. He traced the lines his father had drawn, the lines that had led him to this damnation, this salvation. His father had sought a cure. He had found a succession. A deep, groaning tremor, entirely different from the heart's hum, shook the cavern. It was a raw, geological sound, the groan of rock strata under immense stress. A fine dust of stone rained down from the unseen ceiling. The island beneath him vibrated, not with contained energy, but with the brute shock of a mountain in distress. The quarantine was more than the cage. The entire mountain, Aethelgard's tooth itself, must have been part of the containment system, its very structure laced with the same ancient technology, dampening the heart's influence. Now, with the cage gone and the heart bonded to a living mobile host, the system was failing. The mountain was waking up, and it was dying. Panic, sharp and blessedly human, cut through his stupor. He shoved the map into his satchel, slung it over his shoulder, and scrambled towards the bridge of black rock. Every step was a battle for balance. The chasm still held its forest of petrified figures, but they seemed different to him now. They were not failures. They were the lucky ones. Their curse had ended. His was just beginning. He set foot on the bridge, and immediately felt the instability. It shivered under his weight, and a fresh shower of pebbles rattled into the abyss. He moved slowly, his right hand trailing along the cavern wall for support. His heavy left arm held out to the side like a counterweight. The crimson light of his body cast long, dancing shadows that made the statues below seem to writhe and reach for him. He reached the other side, just as a section of the bridge 50 paces behind him cracked, groaned and plunged into the darkness with a final, booming crash. He didn't look back. He plunged into the mouth of the tunnel, into the waiting darkness, or what should have been darkness. The tunnel was no longer lit by the faint green-silver phosphorescence. The geometric patterns on the walls were dark, inert. But as he took his first step inside, the patterns nearest him flared to life, not with their original light, but with a deep, pulsing crimson, a perfect echo of the energy that now flowed through his veins. They lit up as he approached and faded to black as he passed. The tunnel was lighting his way, acknowledging its new master. The mountain recognized the heart inside him. The groaning of the rock grew louder, more insistent. The smooth, carved walls of the tunnel began to show stress fractures. He broke into a stumbling run, a lopsided, jarring gait that sent jolts of sensation through his crystalline arm. He could feel the mountain's distress through it, a web of seismic vibrations, of rock being crushed and twisted on a scale that dwarfed his own concerns. A section of the ceiling ahead collapsed, a ton of rock crashing to the floor with a deafening roar, throwing up a cloud of choking dust. He recoiled, his path blocked. Before he could even think, he felt a sharp, preemptive vibration in his left arm, a clear warning of structural failure. He instinctively threw himself to the right, pressing his body against the wall, just as another cascade of stone fell precisely where he had been standing. His crystal arm was not just a weight, it was a sense organ, reading the language of the stone, the oldest language of all. He clambered over the fresh rockfall, his glowing hand casting eerie shadows. The air grew thinner, colder. He could feel the draft of the outside world, a promise of escape. The tunnel ahead began to lose its impossible geometry. The walls grew rougher, more natural, the failing technology revealing the raw cave it had been carved from. The crimson lights on the walls flickered and died behind him as the system shut down for good. He was running on borrowed time. He rounded a final bend and saw it, a ragged fissure of grey, misty light. The entrance, freedom! He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning, his strange, mismatched body screaming with effort. He burst through the opening, half falling onto the narrow, wind-swept ledge where his journey into the mountain had begun. He lay there, panting, the cold, wet air a shock after the dry stillness of the deep earth. The world outside was as he had left it, a formless sea of grey mist, a sky of pewter. But it was no longer the same world, because he was no longer the same man. The mournful sigh of the wind felt different now. Less a sound, and more a pressure he could sense on his translucent skin. He pushed himself up, leaning against the frozen scree, and looked out over the abyss. He held up his hands in the flat, revealing light of the overcast day. The right was still faintly luminous, a strange and beautiful horror. The left was a weapon, a shield, a key to a world of stone he had never known existed. He was a thing of myth now, a creature that belonged in the faded tapestries of forgotten kings. He thought of his village, of the people he knew, of the life he had been so desperate to save. How could he ever go back? How could he face them looking like this? They would not see a man who had conquered a curse. They would see a new one, a walking blight of a different and more terrifying kind. The cure had cost him not just his humanity, but his home, his past, his very name. He, Kaelen, son of the cartographer, was dead. The creature that had taken his place had yet to choose a new one. The ledge gave a sharp, cracking shudder, not a tremor from deep within the mountain, but a localized structural failure. Kaelen threw himself backwards, landing hard on the frozen scree inside the fissure, as the entire platform of rock he had been standing on sheared away from the cliff face. It hung for a sickening moment, suspended over the churning mist, then peeled away with a great grinding roar, vanishing into the grey abyss. His only way down was gone. He was trapped on the spine of a dying god, and the corpse was beginning to twitch. He pressed his back against the rock, the vibrations of the mountain's agony travelling up his own spine and resonating with the crystalline half of his body. It was a terrible symphony of shearing granite groaning strata, and the deep, final sighs of a structure failing under its own impossible weight. He could feel it all, a dizzying overload of geological data that threatened to overwhelm him. The mountain was unravelling. There was no time for grief or horror. Survival was a more primal instinct. His climbing rope was gone, lost with his pack when the ledge collapsed. He was left with only the clothes on his back, the satchel with his father's map, and this new monstrous body. He looked down the sheer western face, the route he had so painstakingly ascended. It was no longer a static puzzle of rock and ice. It was a shifting death trap. Small rockfalls, like streams of grey water, were becoming more frequent, scarring the cliff with fresh wounds. He had to descend, and he had to do it now. He approached the new raw edge of the cliff. He placed his left hand, his obsidian hand, flat against the rock face. The connection was instantaneous. The chaotic vibrations of the mountain focused through his arm into a coherent, tactile map. He could feel the stress lines, the fractures, the pockets of unstable scree. He could sense the solid, load-bearing sections of granite like islands of stability in a sea of decay. It was the same way he had once read a vellum map. But this was a living text, and the language was disaster. He began to climb down. It was a clumsy, brutal parody of his ascent. His crystalline arm was a perfect anchor, its obsidian talons finding purchase in fissures too small for human fingers, its immense weight providing a stability that defied gravity. But his right side was a liability. His glowing hand felt slick and strange against the cold rock, and his human leg scrabbled for holds, its muscles already screaming with the strain of supporting his unbalanced mass. He was a lopsided crab, skittering down the face of a collapsing world. Twice his crystalline arm saved him. The first time, he felt a deep, resonant thrum that warned him a section of rock to his left was about to give way. He threw his weight to the right, clinging by his fingertips, as a section of the cliff the size of a small cottage tore loose and plunged into the mist. The second time, a rockfall from above cascaded down on him. He had no time to move, only to press himself flat and raise his left arm over his head. The stones, some as large as his head, hammered against the obsidian limb with deafening cracks. But it didn't so much as chip. He felt the impacts as jarring vibrations, but there was no pain, only the cold, alien resilience of the starshot crystal. After what felt like an eternity of this terrifying, controlled fall, he found refuge in a shallow overhang, a small cave carved out by the wind. He wedged himself inside, his back against the rock, and allowed himself a moment to breathe. The mist had thinned slightly as he descended, and through ragged rents in the grey, he could see the lower slopes of the Dragon's Teeth, a brutal landscape of shattered rock and ancient gnarled ice. He looked at his right hand. The light within it seemed to pulse in time with his ragged breathing. He had used his left arm as a tool of survival, an instrument of brute force and sensation. But this right hand, it was the side that felt the heart's cosmic memories, the side that contained its essence. He held it up, focusing his will, trying to command the energy within. The glow intensified, the warmth growing until it was a palpable heat. He touched his glowing fingertips to the damp wall of the cave. There was a hiss, like water on a hot forge. The rock beneath his fingers did not burn. It softened, melting like wax. He drew a line in the granite, which cooled and rehardened almost instantly, leaving a smooth, glassy scar in the rough stone. He stared at it, a cold dread mixing with a kind of terrible wonder. Creation and ruin. His left arm could withstand destruction. His right could reshape reality. He was a walking engine of paradox, a weapon and a tool forged in the heart of a fallen star. The loneliness returned, sharp and absolute. Who in this world could possibly understand what he had become? He was utterly, completely alone. A sharp, metallic chink from below cut through his thoughts. He froze, every sense on high alert. It wasn't the sound of falling rock. It was precise, deliberate, man-made. He peered over the edge of his overhang. About 200 feet below him, traversing a narrow, ice-slicked ridge, was a figure. They were swathed in furs and leather, moving with the slow, sure-footed confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime in the high peaks. He could see the glint of a steel piton as they hammered it into a crack in the rock. His first instinct was to hide, to retreat into the shadows of his cave and wait for the person to pass. But where could he go? And what was anyone doing on Aethelgard's tooth? Especially now, when the mountain was tearing itself apart. Driven by a desperate, foolish need for contact, for a sign that he hadn't left the entire human race behind, he began to descend again, moving as quietly as his mismatched body would allow. He closed the distance carefully, using the terrain and the swirling mist for cover. He reached a ledge just above the ridge the figure was crossing and watched. It was a woman. Her face, framed by a hood of grey wolf fur, was a road map of wrinkles, her skin tanned to the colour of old leather by a lifetime of wind and sun. She was old, perhaps older than anyone he had ever seen, but her movements were economical and strong. She seemed completely unperturbed by the mountain's death throes, moving through the tremors and rockfalls as if they were minor inconveniences, like swatting away flies. Suddenly, she stopped. She didn't look up, not at first. She simply stood still, one hand braced against the rock face, her head cocked as if listening to something Kaelen couldn't hear. Then slowly, she raised her head and her eyes met his. They were pale, the colour of a winter sky, and they held no fear, only a deep, unsettling wisdom and an unnerving amount of curiosity. "The mountain sings a new song today," she said. Her voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together, yet it carried clearly in the thin air. I felt it when the old rhythm broke. I wondered what kind of creature would be born from it. Kaelen was speechless. He clung to the rock, half hidden, his monstrous nature on full display in the grey light. She didn't recoil. Her gaze travelled from his bisected face, down the glowing veins on his neck, to his obsidian arm, and then to his translucent hand. She nodded slowly, a thoughtful, appraising look on her weathered face. So, one of the stone-blooded folk finally reached the heart. I had thought it was only a legend to frighten children. Who are you? Kaelen managed, his voice hoarse. They call me Elara in the valleys. When they bother to remember I exist, she said, her eyes never leaving him. She gestured with her chin at the peak above them, which was now completely obscured by a fresh cloud of rock dust. You have broken something very old, Stone Son, older than mountains. The cage is open. Did you think the bars were all that held the power in? The mountain. It's falling apart, he stated, the words feeling stupid and obvious. It is unravelling, she corrected him. Its purpose is finished. The loom that wove this peak into the world has been shattered. The threads are coming loose. Her pale eyes narrowed. You carry the heart now. You are the heart. Can you not feel the threads snapping all the way down to the roots? He could. He had been so focused on his own transformation, his own survival, that he hadn't truly listened to what the mountain was telling him. Now that she had given him the words, the concept, he focused his crystal sense outward, downward. He could feel the network of ancient energies that underpinned the entire range failing, the power draining away, causing a cascade of physical collapse. The death of Aethelgard's tooth was not an isolated event. It was a disease that was about to spread. What have I done? He whispered, the true scale of his actions crashing down on him. You have kept a promise your ancestors made without understanding the price, Elara said, her tone devoid of judgment. The old blood seeks its source. The curse was a homing instinct, a seed calling for its star. You have answered, and now the unravelling will spread. The valleys will shake, the rivers will forget their courses. The deep places, sealed by the mountain's power, will open. You did not just find a cure for yourself, boy. You have brought about the end of an age. Her words struck him harder than any falling rock. He had come here to save himself from a slow, quiet death, and had instead become the harbinger of a loud and violent one for the world he knew. He was not a monster because of how he looked. He was a monster because of what he had unleashed. The weight of her pronouncement settled on him, a pressure far greater than the tons of rock overhead. He had been so consumed by the intimate scale of his own transformation that he had failed to see the larger map. He, the cartographer, had become the epicenter of a cataclysm, a walking, breathing tear in the fabric of the world. The curse had not been a sickness in his bloodline. It had been a key, passed down through generations, waiting for the one with the will and desperation to turn it in the lock. And he had done it, the end of an age. He echoed the words tasting like ash. The valleys, my home. Your home is a line drawn on a map that is now being erased, Elara said, her voice sharp, but not unkind. She began moving again, coiling her rope with an unhurried efficiency that was terrifying in its calm. Grieving for the world that was is a luxury we no longer have. The world that requires our immediate attention. As if to punctuate her words, a deep, foundational boom resonated up from the mountain's roots. It was not the sharp crack of falling rock, but a muffled internal explosion, as if one of the mountain's great subterranean pillars had finally given way. The entire cliff face they were on sagged, dropping a good 10 feet in a sickening lurch that sent a fresh avalanche of ice and stone pouring into the abyss. Kaelen's obsidian hand shot out, his talons digging into the rock face, anchoring him. He felt the shockwave of the collapse travel through the stone, a wave of pure kinetic force that would have shattered his human bones. Elara, lighter and more agile, had dropped into a climber's crouch, her body moving with the rock, absorbing the jolt. The time for talking is over. Stone Son, she called out, her voice tight with effort. The path I took to get up here is gone. We go down your way. Lead on. Show me what that new arm can do besides look terrifying. There was no choice. He pushed off, the raw data of the mountain's decay feeding into his mind through his crystalline arm. It was a cacophony of stress and imminent failure. But within the noise, he could sense a path. A line of slightly more stable rock, a series of load-bearing structures that might just hold for a few more minutes. He became the needle on a seismograph, reading the tremors to find the quietest line. He moved with a speed that should have been impossible for his unbalanced body, his obsidian arm punching into the rock face ahead of him, creating anchors where none existed. He would drive his crystalline fingers into a section of granite, test its integrity with a single thought, and then swing his lighter, human side around, his boot finding a precarious hold. He was a living piton, a grotesque but effective tool of descent. Elara followed, moving with a silent, swift grace that belied her age. She followed his path without question, trusting his strange new senses implicitly. She was the wisdom, he was the power, and together they formed a single desperate unit of survival. They were halfway down a particularly sheer face when the unravelling manifested in a new and terrifying way. For a single heart-stopping second, the world tilted. It wasn't the rock moving. It was gravity itself, which seemed to lose its conviction, shifting its pull a few degrees to the east. Kaelen felt his body swing out from the cliff face. his entire weight suddenly hanging from the talons of his left hand. Below him, Elara cried out as her feet slipped from their holds, her own rope saving her as she dangled free in the air. A river of loose scree on a nearby slope stopped flowing downwards and began to slide sideways, as if the mountain had become a vertical wall. Then, just as suddenly, the world snapped back to normal. Kaelen swung back against the rock with a jarring thud, the impact resonating through his stone side. Elara scrambled to find her footing again, her face pale beneath its leathery tan. "The threads," she panted, looking around with wide, knowing eyes. "And the laws of fraying." Kaelen felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the altitude. He had not just broken the mountain, he had broken the rules that held the world together. He looked at his right hand, the hand that could melt stone, the hand that held the pure essence of the heart. He was a piece of another universe, an anomaly whose very presence was causing reality to buckle. He forced the thought away. They kept moving. The descent was a blur of calculated risks and instinctual saves. He cleared a path through an icefall by touching it with his glowing hand, the ancient ice hissing and sublimating into clouds of steam without ever melting into water. He dislodged a precariously balanced boulder with a focused push from his obsidian arm, feeling the subtle fractures within it and applying pressure at the precise point needed to send it tumbling harmlessly away from their path. He was learning, adapting, the desperate need to survive, forging his new, disparate parts into a functional whole. Finally, they reached a wide, snow-dusted ledge, perhaps the last stable place on this side of the dying peak. They were below the worst of the upper collapses, the air thick enough to breathe without a searing pain in the lungs. The foothills, a rumpled carpet of dark green forest and grey rock, were visible below them through the thinning mist. They had made it off the main peak. Elara slumped against the back wall of the ledge, pulling a water skin from her pack and drinking deeply. Kaelen stood apart, his back to her, looking down at the world he had just condemned. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant rumble of the mountain and the sigh of the wind. "I can't go down there," he said, his voice a low rasp. He held up his hands, one a tool of impossible resilience, the other a vessel of terrifying power. "They'll see me, and they'll see a monster. They'll be right. They will see what they are told to see," Elara replied, her voice regaining its strength. "They will see a demon if a priest points a finger. They will see a savior if a king offers a crown. Right now, all they will see is a child who is afraid of himself." He turned on her, a spark of his old anger flaring. "I've broken the world. What is there to be but afraid?" "Afraid? Yes, that is a sensible reaction," she conceded, getting to her feet. She walked towards him, her steps sure on the uneven ground. She stopped a few feet away, her pale eyes studying him intently. "But you cannot let fear be your master. You are the heart now, Stone Son. Its power and its memory flow through you. That is a responsibility, not just a curse. Responsibility? To what? To preside over the rubble? No," she said, her gaze firm. "To find the balance. The power that built this mountain, the power that caged the heart. It was not native to this world either. It was a balancing force, a lock to fit the key you now carry. When the mountain finishes its collapse, that power will be gone. But there are other places, other locks, other deep slumbering things that were held in check by the mountain's song." She raised a wrinkled hand and pointed south, towards a distant range of jagged black peaks that pierced the horizon. "That is the Iron Moor, a place of angry, sleeping gods, sealed long ago, When Aethelgard's tooth is silenced, they will begin to stir. The unravelling you have started will be a dinner bell for them. A new chilling layer of understanding fell into place for Kaelen. He wasn't just the catalyst for destruction. He was now the only thing that could stand against the far worse things his actions would awaken. The paradox of his existence deepened. The agent of ruin was now the only candidate for protector. "You want me to fight gods?" he asked, the idea so absurd it was almost laughable. "I want you to become what you are," Elara corrected him. "You are a power of this world now, equal to them. You are a walking lock, a key, a creator, and a destroyer. You must learn to be the cartographer of your own soul, to map your new abilities, understand your limits, and impose your own order on the chaos you have unleashed. Your father's map led you here. Now you must draw your own." She took another step closer, her eyes fixed on his glowing right hand. "Your journey is not over. It has just begun. You will go to the foothills, and you will learn. Then you will travel south. You will feel the stirring of the world, and you will answer it. Because if you do not, no one else can." He looked from her impossibly ancient, knowing face to the distant menacing peaks of the Iron Moor. The path his father had set him on had ended in fire and transformation. Now, this old woman was drawing him a new map, one that led not to a cure, but to an endless lonely war against the encroaching darkness. It was a monstrous fate, a terrible burden. But as he looked at his own monstrous hands, he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his very core, that it was the only fate that fit him anymore. The silence that followed her words was a different kind of silence from the one in the heart of the mountain. That had been the silence of a vacuum, of a force contained. This was the silence of a page being turned, the quiet breath before the first sentence of a new and terrible chapter. Kaelen looked from the distant, threatening peaks of the Iron Moor back to his own hands. A cartographer of his own soul. The idea was so immense, so absurd, it almost broke him. He had only ever known how to chart the known world. Now he was the unknown, a moving frontier of rock and light. How? He asked, the single word a vessel for all his fear and inadequacy. Where do I even begin? Elara pulled her fur hood tighter around her face, her pale eyes glinting in the grey light. You begin with a single step, the same way you chart a kingdom. Come, the foothills will be our first lesson. She didn't wait for an answer, turning and beginning a careful descent down a steep, scree-filled gully that offered the most direct path off the ledge. Left with no other choice, Kaelen followed. The transition from the sheer rock faces to the loose, shifting scree was another harsh lesson in the mechanics of his new body. His heavy left side wanted to plunge downhill, to become an avalanche of one. He had to consciously use his human leg as a rudder, and his right arm as a counterbalance. His movements jarring and graceless, Elara, despite her age, moved like a ghost, her feet barely disturbing the loose stones. She never looked back, her confidence in his ability to follow both a comfort and a burden. As they descended, the world changed. The raw, elemental language of the high peaks, the deep groans of bedrock, the sharp crack of ice, gave way to a more complex and subtle grammar. They reached the tree line, a ragged border of stunted, wind-scoured pines that clung to life with a fierce tenacity. Here, Kaelen's senses were flooded. His obsidian arm, which had read the mountain's bones, now felt the slow, deep life in the roots of the ancient trees. He could feel the patient flow of water through the soil, the skittering of a vole in its burrow deep in the scree, the silent seismic weight of the forest. It was a deluge of information, and he had to clench his crystalline fist to keep from being overwhelmed. His right side experienced it differently. Through his crimson eye, the world was a tapestry of faint energies. The pines hummed with a dim green light, a stark contrast to the inert grey of the stone. He could see the lingering warmth where a mountain hare had rested moments before, a fading thermal ghost. He was seeing the world in layers, a living map of force and matter, and it was utterly disorienting. They stopped in a small sheltered clearing where a stream, milky with glacial silt, tumbled over moss-covered rocks. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The rumbles from the peak above were more distant now, a constant grim reminder of the chaos he had unleashed. Elara produced a chunk of hard, dry bread and a piece of smoked meat from her pack. She offered some to him. He took the bread, his glowing fingers feeling the coarse texture. He put it to his lips, but the moment it touched his tongue, his body rebelled. It was not a taste, but a fundamental incompatibility. It was like trying to feed a fire with sand. The bread was just matter, devoid of the energy his new biology craved. He lowered it, a fresh wave of alienation washing over him. Another piece of his old life, the simple act of sharing a meal, was now lost to him. Elara watched him, her expression unreadable. "The old fuel no longer burns in your new forge," she observed, taking a bite of her own bread. "There is a hunger, is there not? Not in your belly. Deeper," he nodded, unable to speak. The hunger was a hollow ache in his core, a feeling like a guttering candle flame. It was a craving for something he couldn't name. "Your human half will wither without sustenance," she explained, wiping her knife on a patch of moss, "and your other half will consume it to survive. You must learn to feed, not on dead things, but on the world's lifeblood. Its raw power." She pointed downstream with her knife. "There is a place, half a day's walk from here, a hot spring hidden in a cave. The water there runs deep, touching the world's hot heart. It is a place of power, weak compared to the Titan's heart, but it will be enough. It will be your first meal." They continued their journey, following the stream as it wound its way down into the thickening forest. The sounds of the world grew more complex. The chatter of birds, the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. At one point, the call of a raven from a high branch seemed to get stuck, repeating the same harsh, guttural call 3 times in rapid succession. A perfect, unnatural loop before falling silent. A minor glitch in the world's code. Kaelen felt the subtle wrongness of it, like a discordant note in a familiar song. But Elara gave no sign she had noticed. As they walked, she began to instruct him, her words as sparse and practical as her movements. "Close your human eye," she commanded. "See only with the heart's light. What is the shape of the life around you?" He did as he was told. The world of form and color dissolved, replaced by a flowing landscape of faint energies. He saw the brighter hum of a patch of sun-drenched ferns, the cooler, slower pulse of the deep moss, the frantic darting sparks of insects. He saw the stream not as water, but as a flowing band of concentrated energy, a vein of life running through the woods. "Now, the other," she said. "Feel only with the stone. Ignore the life. What does the land itself tell you?" He closed his crimson eye and focused on the sensations in his left arm. The forest vanished, replaced by a tactile map of weight and structure. He felt the solid mass of a granite outcrop buried beneath the soil 50 paces to their left. He felt the subtle give of a patch of damp, unstable earth just ahead on their path. He could feel the different densities of the tree roots, a subterranean web holding the hillside together. "You have 2 ways of seeing." Elara's voice cut through his concentration. "One sees the river, the other sees the riverbed. Both are true, both are incomplete. Your task is to see with both at once, to read the whole map, not just one of its layers. He tried. He opened both eyes and let the two contradictory realities flood his mind. The world swam, a nauseating superposition of matter and energy, of life and stone. Vertigo seized him, and he stumbled, catching himself with his obsidian hand against the trunk of a massive fir tree. The solid impact, the feeling of the rough bark under his crystal fingers, and the green hum of the tree's life in his mind helped to anchor him. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The two visions were not merging, but they were beginning to coexist, like two images in a stereoscope resolving into a single, three-dimensional view of impossible depth. By late afternoon, the air grew thick with the smell of sulfur, and steam coiled like ghosts through the trees. Elara led him to a fissure in a rock face, almost completely hidden by hanging curtains of moss. The entrance was narrow, forcing Kaelen to turn sideways to fit his broad, crystalline shoulder through. The cave was small, a single chamber filled with dense, warm steam. In the center was a pool of water, so black it seemed to drink the faint light filtering in from the entrance. The water was perfectly still, its surface like polished obsidian, though wisps of steam rose from it in a slow, constant dance. The air hummed, not with sound, but with a low-grade geothermal energy that made Kaelen's translucent skin tingle. This was the place. The hunger in his core resonated with the power in the cave, a quiet, insistent thrum. "This is a place of healing for normal folk," Elara said. Her voice hushed in the enclosed space. "For you, it is a feasting hall. Do not drink the water. Touch it. Connect with it. Take only what you need. This spring is a small thing, and the world is already out of balance." He approached the pool's edge, his mismatched reflection wavering in the dark water. A monster of light and shadow. He knelt, the stone floor cool beneath his knee. He felt a flicker of fear, a primal hesitation. He was about to willingly connect himself to another unknown force, to invite more of the world's raw power into his already unstable soul. But the hunger was a powerful motivator, a void that demanded to be filled. He extended his right hand, the one of pure energy, and slowly lowered it towards the water. The moment his glowing fingertips touched the surface, the pool came alive. The black water lit up from within, a web of incandescent blue and white light spreading from his hand like lightning through a thundercloud. The energy of the spring, ancient and elemental, surged up his arm. It was not a violent torrent like the heart's power, but a slow, warm river. It flowed into him, filling the hollow ache in his core, banking the guttering flame of his life force into a steady, solid glow. He felt his human half drink it in, the deep cellular exhaustion of his ordeal easing. He felt his other half accept it, a lesser power acknowledging its master. He drew on the energy, feeling for the point of balance Elara had spoken of, the point where his need was met without draining the source. He found it, a sense of equilibrium, and slowly withdrew his hand. The light in the pool faded, the water returning to its placid black stillness. The hunger was gone, replaced by a feeling of quiet, immense power. He felt solid, whole for the first time since his transformation. He looked at his right hand. The crimson light within it was brighter, steadier. He focused his will, not on melting stone, but on a smaller, more controlled act. A single loose pebble on the bottom of the pool became the focus of his entire universe. He reached his glowing hand back into the water, but this time he did not draw its power. He let his own energy flow out, a delicate, controlled tendril of crimson light that wrapped around the small grey stone. He remembered the feel of shaping clay as a child, the satisfaction of turning a lump of earth into a recognizable form. This was the same, but his hands were his will, and his clay was the very fabric of the rock. He didn't melt it. He commanded it. He felt the crystalline structure of the quartz within the pebble, the lines of force that held it together. He pushed against those lines, not with brute force, but with a precise resonant frequency, persuading the atoms to realign. The water around the pebble began to simmer, then to boil silently in the dark pool, a halo of turbulence in the otherwise placid water. He ignored it, focusing solely on the stone. It softened not from heat, but from a loss of its own structural integrity. It became plastic, malleable to his thought. He smoothed its rough edges, rounded its form, compressing it, polishing it, until it was no longer a random piece of debris. He lifted his hand from the water. Floating in his palm, held aloft by a faint crimson glow, was a perfect sphere of obsidian black stone, its surface polished to a mirror sheen. It was flawless, a small globe of captured night. Good. Elara's voice was a soft rasp from the cave entrance. You gave it order. She stepped closer, her pale eyes fixed not on the sphere, but on the gently steaming water of the pool. But you boiled the water. Your control is a hammer, stone son. You have learned to strike a specific nail, but you still shake the whole wall. Every act of creation you perform with that hand will have a cost in chaos. Every act of destruction with the other will have a cost in sterile order. You are the balance. Do not forget it. He let the sphere drop into his human palm. It was cool and impossibly smooth. A perfect thing born of a monstrous act. He closed his fingers around it, a tangible reminder of what he now was. They left the cave and stepped back into the forest. The change was immediate and profound. The air was utterly still, not just windless. The very background noise of the forest had ceased. No bird song, no insect chitter, no rustle of leaves. The stream beside them flowed on, but it seemed to make no sound, its passage over the rocks a silent film. It was a silence so absolute it felt like a pressure against the eardrums. The unravelling accelerates, Elara said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the dead air. She scanned the motionless canopy. The world's breath is held. A law has been suspended. We cannot linger here. This place is becoming a ghost of itself. They moved with a new urgency, descending from the high woods into the broader, gentler slopes of the valley proper. The unnatural silence followed them for a mile, before breaking as suddenly as it had begun, the world's sound rushing back in a disorienting wave. Kaelen stumbled, his senses reeling from the sudden transition. He was beginning to understand. The glitches weren't random. They were spreading, localized pockets of reality breaking down, like a disease taking hold in the land's flesh. As they traveled, he practiced what Elara had taught him, constantly trying to reconcile his two modes of vision. He learned to see the world in its full terrifying depth. He saw a mighty oak, not just as wood and leaf, but as a slow green fire of life, anchored to a dense, complex structure of stone and soil. He saw a deer, frozen in the undergrowth, as both a fleeting warm flare of biological energy and a fragile collection of bone and sinew. He was learning to read the whole map. Late the next day, they reached a ridge overlooking a small, isolated town nestled in the crook of the valley. It was called Oakhaven, a logging settlement he knew from his father's charts. Smoke curled from a dozen chimneys, and the distant rhythmic thud of axes echoed faintly up the slope. It looked peaceful, an island of mundane life in a world that was losing its mind. But as he looked, truly looked with his new senses, he saw that it was not. To his crimson eye, there was a shimmer over the center of the town, a subtle distortion in the air like heat haze. Only it gave off no warmth. It was a patch of reality that seemed to be vibrating at a different frequency from its surroundings. To his stone sense, the very ground beneath the town square felt thin, unstable, as if the bedrock there had been replaced with stretched parchment. "You see it?" Elara stated, her gaze fixed on the town, a knot in the thread, a place where the pattern has begun to repeat. They made their way down into the outskirts, avoiding the main track and slipping between the tall pines that bordered the town. They stopped behind the solid stone walls of the local smithy. The rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel, a comforting solid sound in a world of growing uncertainty. From their hiding place, they could see the town square. It was a scene of baffling, quiet madness. A woman with a basket of laundry walked from the well towards a cottage. But as she reached the halfway point, she would flicker, her form blurring for an instant, before she found herself back at the well, a look of faint, repetitive confusion on her face before she began the same journey again. 2 children were tossing a ball, but the arc of the throw was wrong. The ball would travel halfway, stop in midair, and then jerk back into the thrower's hand as if on an invisible string. A dog chasing its tail spun in a perfect, unending circle, its paws never seeming to tire. The entire square, an area of perhaps 100 paces across, was caught in a series of tiny, overlapping temporal loops, its occupants trapped in a prison of seconds. The people outside the square seemed oblivious, their gazes sliding past the bizarre scene as if their minds refused to process what they were seeing. "They are caught," Elara murmured, her voice grim. "The unravelling is not always violent. Sometimes it is a quiet cage. What can we do?" Kaelen asked, his hand instinctively going to the stone sphere in his pocket. He was the cause. This was his fault. The local laws of time and causality are frayed here, Elara explained, her eyes scanning the shimmering air. Something needs to anchor them again, a constant, a paradox that is stronger than this instability. She turned her pale eyes on him. "You are a piece of another reality. Your very existence is a violation of the laws of this world. You are the strongest paradox here. You are the anchor." The implication was clear. He had to step into that broken space. He had to willingly enter the quiet cage and become its foundation. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through him. What if he became trapped like the others? What if his mind was wiped clean, forced to repeat a single mindless action for eternity? He looked at the woman by the well, her face a mask of mild, recurring puzzlement. It was a fate worse than death. But then he looked at his hands, at the evidence of his own survival. He was no longer subject to the same rules as these people. He was the reason the rules were breaking. He was the sickness and perhaps the only cure. He pulled his hood lower, obscuring the glowing half of his face as much as possible. "Tell me what I need to do. The stone is your anchor to the physical world, the unchanging, the past," Elara instructed, her voice low and intense. "The light is your connection to the heart, the unbound, the potential. You must plant your feet and become a pillar between the two. Ground the chaos. Do not try to fight it. Do not try to unravel it. Simply be. Be more real than it is." He took a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beat of his human heart. He stepped out from behind the smithy. No one noticed him. Their attention was either fixed on their work or averted from the strangeness in the square. He walked towards the shimmering air, the boundary of the anomaly. As he drew closer, he could feel it, a strange buzzing pressure against his mind, a sense of temporal drag. He reached the edge of the square. He could see the individual loops now, the invisible seams in time. He saw the woman flicker back to the well. He saw the ball snap back into the child's hand. He took one more step, and the world went mad. Time did not just stop. It shattered. The moment he crossed the invisible threshold, reality broke against him like a pane of glass. The world became a kaleidoscope of repeating moments. He saw the woman at the well from a dozen angles at once. A stuttering chain of the same second, her arm forever beginning its reach for the bucket. The children's thrown ball became a static constellation of brown leather spheres, each hanging in a slightly different position along its aborted arc. The sound was worse. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer was no longer a rhythm, but a solid wall of noise, 1,000 strikes happening in the same instant. The children's laughter was a high, thin, unending chord. His own footsteps were a confusing echo, the sound of his boot crunching on the gravel, arriving both before and after he took the step. Through his crimson eye, the life auras of the trapped townsfolk were tangled, snarled knots of light endlessly looping back on themselves. Through his obsidian sense, the ground beneath his feet was a terrifying void, a patch of existence with no physical foundation. He felt an immense nauseating vertigo, a sense that he was about to fall through the bottom of the world. The anomaly sensed him, a foreign object in its closed system. It tried to assimilate him, to give him a loop of his own. A memory, sharp and seductive, rose in his mind. His father's workshop, the scent of ink and old vellum, the soft scratch of a quill on a new map. His father turns, his face not yet touched by the blight, and smiles. "Almost done, son," he says, his voice warm and real. "Just one more line to draw." The urge to stay there, to live in that perfect, painless second for eternity, was a physical pull, a siren song for his exhausted soul. Be more real than it is. Elara's words cut through the illusion. This memory was a lie, a cage with gilded bars. He was not that boy anymore. He was this, a monster, a paradox. He planted his left foot, the one on his crystalline side. He drove the thought of it down, not just onto the gravel of the square, but through the thin patch of reality, seeking the bedrock he knew must lie somewhere beneath. His obsidian leg became an anchor of pure physical law, a declaration of mass and gravity. It felt like driving a spike into a hurricane. The chaotic energies of the loop recoiled from the absolute unchanging nature of the stone. Then he raised his right hand, the glowing translucent one. He did not clench it into a fist to fight, but opened it, palm up, like an offering. He let the power of the heart flow, not outward to reshape, but inward to define. He became a conduit for its cosmic certainty. The crimson light intensified, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm. A heartbeat against the frantic, stuttering pulse of the broken time around him. He was a pillar. His left side was the foundation, rooted in the immutable past, in the geological truth of the world. His right side was the spire, reaching into the unbound potential of the now, a beacon of pure energy. He was the line drawn between what was and what could be, and in the space he occupied, there was no room for the broken loop of what is a low, resonant hum began to emanate from him, a perfect chord that pushed back against the dissonant noise of the square. The shimmering air around him grew taut, stretched thin. The multiple images of the woman at the well began to converge. The constellation of thrown balls resolved into a single point of motion. With a sound like a great, indrawn breath, reality snapped back into place. The hammer in the smithy completed its swing, striking the anvil with a single deafening clang. The woman at the well finished drawing her bucket, a look of profound confusion on her face as she stared at the water, having no memory of the last 5 minutes of effort. The children's ball landed with a soft thud in the catcher's hands. The dog, dizzy, stumbled and fell in a heap. Silence. Every head in the square, and those in the surrounding street, turned towards him. He stood alone in the centre of it all, his hood having fallen back in the effort. His face was on full display, one half a man's, pale and sweating, the other a glowing, translucent death mask with an eye of pure crimson light. His obsidian arm hung at his side like a piece of a fallen statue, and his right hand still pulsed with a soft alien glow. A woman screamed. One of the children began to cry. A man fumbled for the wood axe tucked into his belt. From the open doors of the smithy, a large, broad-shouldered man emerged, wiping soot from his hands on a leather apron. He held a heavy smithing hammer in one hand, its head still faintly glowing from the forge. His face was a mask of grim suspicion and fear. What are you?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. He took a protective step in front of the children. What just happened? Kaelen opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he possibly say? I broke the world, and I was just trying to fix this tiny piece of it." Before he could stammer out a reply, Elara stepped from the shadows of the smithy. She moved with an unhurried grace, her ancient face calm and authoritative. She placed herself between Kaelen and the blacksmith, a frail-looking but immovable object. "Peace, Borin," she said, her raspy voice cutting through the rising tension. "Put your hammer down. This is not a demon." The blacksmith Borin stared at her, then back at Kaelen. "Elara? What in the gods' names are you doing with that?" "The mountain has a fever," Elara said, her words carefully chosen, weaving a new story on the loom of their fear. "Aethelgard's tooth is sick. You have all felt the tremors. The sickness is seeping into the valleys. It makes time stumble. It makes the stone forget its nature. What you just felt was a symptom of that fever." She gestured towards Kaelen, not with fear, but with a strange reverence. "He is a stone warden, one of the old blood, awakened by the mountain's pain to soothe its fever. He bears the mark of the deep earth and the heart's fire. He has just grounded the sickness here at great cost to himself." It was a masterful lie, woven from threads of truth. Kaelen could see the effect it had on the townsfolk. They didn't understand, not truly, but she had given their fear a name and a context. Stone Warden. It sounded ancient, powerful, something that belonged to the folklore of the mountains. A thing to be feared, but perhaps not destroyed on sight. Borin did not lower his hammer. His knuckles were white. "Cost? He looks like he could shatter my anvil with a flick of his wrist. Look closer, Smith," Elara said softly. Kaelen felt it then. The cost she had spoken of. The act of anchoring had drained him in a way feeding from the spring had not. It had hollowed him out. The crimson light in his eye and hand was dimmer now, the glow less vibrant. A deep, profound exhaustion settled into his human half, a weariness that went bone deep. He felt thinner, less present, as if in reinforcing reality, he had given a piece of his own away. Each act of mending would unravel him, just as he had unraveled the world. He met Borin's gaze, and for the first time, he let the man see not the monster, but the exhausted, terrified man inside. Borin's eyes narrowed. He was a practical man, a man who understood stress in metal, the breaking points of things. He saw the weariness in Kaelen's human eye, the tremor in his stance. He lowered his hammer, though he did not release it. "The tremors," he said, his voice dropping. "The last one, something changed. The iron I draw from the red vein mine. It's wrong. Wrong how? Elara asked, seizing the new thread. It won't hold an edge, Borin grumbled, gesturing back towards his forge. I heat it, I quench it, I work it as my father and his father taught me. But the steel comes out brittle. It shatters like glass under the hammer. It's as if the iron itself has forgotten how to be strong. Kaelen felt a faint, sympathetic vibration in his crystalline arm. The stone forgets its nature. Elara's lie was truer than she knew. The laws were fraying, not just for time and space, but for the fundamental properties of matter itself. The iron from the mine was sick, another symptom of the great unravelling. The fever runs deep in the rock, Elara said, her gaze flicking to Kaelen. The warden can feel it. Kaelen knew what she was doing. She was giving him a purpose in their eyes, a problem to solve that would turn him from an abstract threat into a potential solution. He was a cartographer of ruin, and here was a new, blighted landscape to chart. He took a hesitant step towards the blacksmith, his mismatched body feeling clumsy and immense under the stares of the townsfolk. "Let me see the ore," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Borin hesitated, his fear warring with the desperation of a craftsman whose livelihood was failing him. He looked at the useless, shattered blades on a nearby bench, then back at the impossible creature before him. With a deep, resigned sigh, he nodded towards the dark maw of the smithy. "In here." As Kaelen followed him into the forge, leaving a stunned crowd and a watchful Elara behind, he knew that this was his new reality. He could not run from the world he had broken. He could only walk through it, one broken piece at a time, and pray that he did not fall apart himself before he could begin to map the path to mending it. The forge was a cavern of heat and shadow, a stark contrast to the cold, unnerving stillness of the square. The air was thick with the metallic tang of cooling iron, and the sharp, acrid scent of coal smoke. Tools hung in orderly ranks on the stone walls, their worn wooden handles polished smooth by a lifetime of use. It was a place of comforting, tangible reality, a world away from the fraying laws outside. Borin's world. The blacksmith pointed a soot-stained finger towards a heap of reddish-brown rock near the base of the massive stone forge. "That's the latest load from the red vein," he said, his voice a low rumble of frustration. "Looks the same as it always has. Feels the same. Weighs the same. But it's hollow." Kaelen knelt, his mismatched body casting a long, distorted shadow in the forge light. He reached out with his human hand, his right, and picked up a piece of the ore. It was heavy, its texture coarse. To his normal senses, Borin was right. It was indistinguishable from any iron ore he had ever seen. But his other senses screamed a different story. He closed his human eye, letting the world resolve into its energetic patterns. The ore in his hand did not have the dull, stable signature of iron. It was a chaotic mess, a faint, flickering light like a swarm of dying fireflies. There was no coherence to it, no central identity. It was a collection of properties that had forgotten the name that bound them together. Then he focused on his left side, the obsidian limb. He placed his crystalline hand on the pile of ore. The sensation was immediate and deeply unsettling. It was like touching a pile of sand that was trying to pretend it was a solid wall. The internal structure was a jumble of fractures and misaligned crystalline planes. There was no integrity, no interlocking strength that made iron iron. The stone had forgotten its own song, its fundamental chord of being. "Its bones are not set right," Kaelen said, the words coming to him unbidden, a translation of the pure data flooding his mind. The memory of its strength is gone. Borin grunted, crossing his thick arms over his leather apron. Memory, it's rock. It doesn't have a memory. It does, Kaelen insisted, looking up at the blacksmith, his bisected face a strange canvas of human earnestness and alien impassivity. Everything does. A pattern. A way of being. Something has smudged the pattern in this rock. That's why your steel is brittle. You are trying to forge a ghost. The blacksmith stared at him, his skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence of his own failed work. He glanced at the pile of shattered blades, each one a testament to hours of wasted, heartbreaking labor. So it's useless? The whole vein? I don't know, Kaelen admitted. He looked at the ore in his hand, then at the great slumbering forge. An idea, terrifying and uncertain, began to form. It was a synthesis of Elara's lessons, not the hammer of his left hand, nor the uncontrolled fire of his right, but something in between. Heat your forge, Borin raised a bushy eyebrow. I've heated it hotter than the hinges of hell. It makes no difference. This time will be different, Kaelen said, a grim certainty in his voice. I will not change the heat. I will change the iron's mind. Suspicion returned to Borin's face, but desperation won out. With a shrug that seemed to shake the entire smithy, he turned to the great bellows. Soon, the rhythmic whoosh of air filled the space, and the bed of coals in the forge began to glow, the light growing from a dull red to a fierce, hungry orange. Kaelen selected a single fist-sized piece of the flawed ore. He did not place it in the fire. Instead, he cradled it in his left hand, the obsidian one. He felt the chaotic, broken structure within the rock, a tactile mess of misplaced atoms. He closed his crystalline fingers around it, not crushing it, but holding it, imposing a template of order and stability onto it with the absolute, unyielding nature of his own star-shot flesh. He was creating a mold not of shape, but of physical law. Now, he said to Borin, his voice tight with concentration. He stepped closer to the forge, extending the hand holding the ore into the roaring heart of the fire. The heat was immense, a physical blow that would have incinerated a normal man's hand. Kaelen felt nothing. His obsidian arm was immune, a piece of the cold, dead vacuum of space that did not acknowledge the concept of heat. But he could feel the ore within his grasp begin to warm, then glow, its internal chaos resisting the imposed order of his hand. Then he brought his right hand into play. He held it just above the other, his glowing, translucent fingers spread wide. He did not touch the ore. He reached into it with his will, with the power of the heart. He let the crimson energy flow, not as a destructive beam, but as a resonant hum. He searched for the faint, flickering ghost of the iron's true pattern, the memory of its strength. He found it, a weak, discordant note in the chaotic noise. He focused all of his being on that note. He amplified it, nurtured it, pouring his own life energy into it, feeding it the power he had drawn from the hot spring. He was singing the iron song back to it, reminding it of what it was supposed to be. To Borin, the scene was one of terrifying elemental power. The man-thing stood with one arm of blackest night and one of burning twilight plunged into the forge. The fire itself seemed to change, the orange flames turning a deep, violet-tinged crimson around Kaelen's hands. A low harmonic hum filled the air, a sound that vibrated deep in the blacksmith's bones, making his teeth ache. Inside Kaelen's mind, it was a battle. His left hand held the physical form, forcing the atoms into alignment. His right hand poured in the conceptual form, reminding the energy what pattern to hold. The ore resisted. The unravelling was a powerful force, a tide of entropy, pulling the iron back towards chaos. He felt his own energy draining away at an alarming rate, the deep weariness from the town square returning with a vengeance. The light in his crimson eye began to pulse erratically. He pushed harder, drawing on a deeper well of resolve. He was the cause of this. He would be the cure. He roared, a guttural, inhuman sound of pure effort, and poured one final, desperate surge of will into the ore. There was a sharp crack like a bell being struck, and the violet light in the forge vanished. The hum ceased. The fire returned to its normal orange-white heat. Panting, his human side slick with sweat, Kaelen withdrew his arms from the fire. He stumbled back, his legs trembling. In the palm of his obsidian hand lay not a lump of ore, but a glowing, perfectly formed ingot of white-hot metal. It was pure, flawless, its light steady and bright. He could feel it now. Its bones were set. Its song was true. He dropped the ingot onto the anvil. It landed with a solid, resonant clang that sounded more real, more fundamentally right than any sound Kaelen had heard since he'd left the mountain. Borin stared, his mouth agape. He tentatively reached out with a pair of tongs, his hands shaking slightly. He gripped the ingot, his practiced eye judging the color, the heat, the very soul of the metal. He placed it on the anvil, raised his hammer, and after a moment's hesitation, struck it. The hammer rebounded with a clean, ringing report. The metal deformed perfectly under the blow, spreading without a hint of a crack or a fissure. He struck it again and again, his blows growing in confidence, the rhythm of his work returning like a half-forgotten prayer. It was perfect, better than any steel he had ever worked in his life. He finally stopped, his broad chest heaving. He looked at the partially worked ingot, then at Kaelen, who was leaning against the smithy wall for support, his glow visibly diminished. The fear in the blacksmith's eyes was gone, replaced by a profound, shell-shocked awe. "By the first smith's beard," he breathed. You healed it," I reminded it, Kaelen corrected, his voice raspy with exhaustion. The effort had cost him dearly. The world seemed muted to his senses now, his connection to the stone and the light feeling distant and frayed. Elara appeared in the doorway, her gaze taking in the scene. The perfect ingot, the awestruck blacksmith, and Kaelen's depleted state. "A single ingot," she said, her voice cutting through the moment. "You have proved it can be done, but you cannot stand in this forge and heal every piece of ore the miners bring down. You have mended a single leaf. The sickness is in the roots of the tree." Borin looked from Elara to the ingot. "The red vein mine," he said, understanding dawning. "The wrongness is coming from the mine itself." "Deeper than that, I suspect," Elara said. "The mine is just a wound on the surface that lets the sickness out. But it is where you must go." Kaelen pushed himself off the wall, his body aching. "What's in that mine?" Borin set his hammer down, his face growing grim. "Old tunnels, deeper than any of us go now. My grandfather used to tell stories. He said the first miners who dug the red vein didn't just find iron. They found a chamber, a place where the rock was carved, but not by human hands. Smooth like polished glass and cold. So cold it would burn you." He looked at Kaelen's obsidian arm. They sealed it off, said it was a place that should have been left sleeping. The unravelling was not just fraying the world, Kaelen realized. It was waking things up. The deep places sealed by the mountain's power will open. Elara's prophecy was coming true. The mine was not the source of the sickness, but a gateway for it. "I need to go there," Kaelen said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a point on a map he was now forced to draw. Borin nodded slowly. He would draw the map. Borin, a man who had only ever charted the known territories of steel and fire, looked at Kaelen and saw a path forward. He turned and strode to a large water barrel, plunging a wooden bucket into it and bringing it back. He didn't offer it to Kaelen, but to Elara, who accepted it with a grateful nod. Then he turned back to the exhausted stone warden. "The forge is still hot," Borin said, his voice stripped of its earlier aggression, now holding a rough, practical respect. "You fed the iron. Maybe the fire can feed you." It was an astute guess, a smith's intuition for the nature of exchange and energy. Kaelen nodded, a barely perceptible motion. He felt hollowed out, as if the act of imposing order on the ingot had scooped out a part of his own soul. He let Borin guide him to a heavy stone bench set near the forge, close enough to feel its radiating heat. He didn't need to touch it. He simply sat, closed his eyes, and let the ambient energy wash over him. It was a thin broth compared to the rich stew of the hot spring, but it was something. He could feel the chaotic, undirected heat of the coals, the stored energy in the hot stone of the forge's walls, the faint, lingering echo of the power he had just expended. He drew it in slowly, a thirsty man sipping water. It wasn't enough to make him whole, but it stopped the terrifying sense of fading away. The dim light in his right hand stabilized, the crimson glow returning from a dull ember to a soft, steady pulse. While he rested, Elara and Borin spoke in low tones, their conversation a murmur of practicality and portents. The blacksmith sketched a rough map on the dusty floor with a piece of charcoal, showing the main shaft of the Red Vein mine, the side tunnels, and the approximate location of the sealed-off chamber his grandfather had described. "It's a half-day's walk, up the western slope," Borin explained, his thick finger tracing a path. "The entrance is shored up with heavy timbers. We haven't worked the deep tunnels for a generation. The air might be bad." "The air will be the least of our concerns," Elara said, her gaze on Kaelen. "We will need lanterns, rope, and your strongest striking hammer." "You mean we?" Borin asked, straightening up. "Old woman, with all respect, that mine is no place for you. And as for him," he gestured to Kaelen, "he can barely stand." "He will be able to stand," Elara stated with finality. "And you are coming with us. He can read the sickness in the stone, but you can read the mine. You know its tricks, its moods. We will need your eyes as much as his." Borin looked as if he wanted to argue, but the protest died in his throat. He looked at the perfect half-formed blade on his anvil, a thing of impossible quality born from his useless ore. This was his town, his trade, his mine. The sickness was a blight on his world, and he was not a man to stand by while others fought his battles. He gave a sharp, decisive nod. "I'll gather the gear. We leave at first light." They spent the night in the smithy. Borin gave his own cot to Elara, and laid out a bed of thick furs for Kaelen near the forge, periodically stoking the coals to keep the heat steady. No one in Oakhaven troubled them. Word of the Stone Warden had spread. A story of a strange, terrifying creature that had somehow righted the hiccup in the world. A tale whispered with a mixture of fear and reluctant hope. They were left alone, isolated in the warm, smoky heart of the town. Kaelen did not sleep. He drifted in a state of heightened awareness, his two sets of senses painting a complex picture of the world around him. He could feel the slow, deep slumber of the bedrock beneath the town, a peace that felt thin and fragile. He could see the faint, interwoven auras of the sleeping townsfolk, their life energies pulsing in a gentle communal rhythm. But he could also feel the source of the wrongness, a constant low-grade hum of dissonance that seemed to be coming from the west, from the direction of the mine. It was a single sour note in the valley's quiet song, and it grated on his very being. They set out as the sky was turning from grey to a pale, washed-out blue. Borin was laden with a heavy pack containing ropes, pitons, oil for the lanterns, and his favourite 12-pound hammer slung over his shoulder. He moved with the quiet competence of a man at home in the wilderness. The air was cold and crisp, and the sounds of the waking town, a crowing rooster, a distant dog's bark, seemed unnervingly normal. As they climbed the forested slope towards the mine, Kaelen noticed more subtle signs of the unravelling. A patch of moss on a boulder was growing in a perfect unnatural spiral. The pattern of the bark on a stand of silver birch seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at it. These were small things, glitches on the periphery of perception, but they spoke of a deeper instability. The world was holding its shape out of habit, but its fundamental integrity was compromised. The entrance to the Red Vein mine was a dark wound in the hillside, framed by massive weathered timbers stained red by years of iron-rich runoff. The ground around it was littered with discarded rust-coloured rock, and even from a distance, Kaelen could feel the hollowness of the place. The dissonant hum he had felt all night was stronger here, a palpable vibration in the stone beneath his feet. Borin lit 2 hooded lanterns, handing one to Elara. The flickering yellow light did little to dispel the oppressive darkness of the mine's opening. "Stay close," the blacksmith grunted, taking the lead. "The main shaft is wide, but the floor is uneven." They stepped inside, and the world changed. The sounds of the forest were instantly cut off, replaced by the dripping of water and the soft crunch of their boots on the gravelly floor. The air was cold, damp, and smelled of wet stone and something else, an ozone-like sharpness, clean and sterile. As they delved deeper, Kaelen's senses became their primary guide. "To the left," he would murmur, and Borin, after a moment's hesitation, would follow his direction. "The timbers in that shaft are rotten. They feel thirsty, brittle." The blacksmith would shine his lantern, revealing wood that looked solid but, when tapped with his hammer, crumbled into dry dust. Kaelen was reading the mine not as a series of tunnels, but as a living or dying organism. He could feel the stress points, the areas of weakness, the places where the stone's memory was thinnest. After an hour of descent, following the path from Borin's charcoal map, they came to it. A side tunnel, deliberately collapsed. A wall of fallen rock and splintered ancient timbers blocked the way. But this was not a natural cave-in. The rocks were piled too neatly, the timbers placed with a clear intent to seal. "This is the place," Borin said, his voice low, the sound swallowed by the immense silence. He ran a hand over one of the massive support beams that framed the collapse. "My grandfather's mark." He pointed to a small, barely visible rune of a hammer and anvil carved into the wood. Elara held her lantern high. They were not trying to keep the tunnel from collapsing. They were trying to keep something in. Kaelen stepped forward, placing his obsidian hand on the wall of rock. The cold that met his fingers was profound. It wasn't the simple absence of heat. It was an active, hungry cold that seemed to leach the energy from the surrounding stone. And beneath the cold, he felt the source of the dissonance, the sour note, now a clear and ringing chime of wrongness. It was coming from beyond this wall. "I can clear this," he said. He needed no hammer, no tools. He found a purchase for his human hand and his boots, braced himself, and drove his crystalline arm into the rockfall. His obsidian fingers, harder than diamond, punched through the softer sandstone and shale. He didn't feel the impact, only the yielding of the lesser material. He gripped a large keystone in the collapse and pulled. Muscles on his human side strained, but the real work was being done by the monstrous limb. It moved with an unnatural, silent strength, pulling the half-ton boulder from the wall as if it were a loose brick. He tossed it aside, the sound of its crash echoing down the tunnel. He cleared another and another, his movements efficient and devastating. He was a living excavation machine, dismantling the wall with a speed and force that left Borin speechless. Within minutes, a dark opening was revealed. A wave of intensely cold, sterile air washed over them, making the lantern flames gutter and shrink. The strange ozone scent was overpowering now. "Give me the lantern," Kaelen said to Borin, his voice a low rasp. He took it and stepped through the opening he had created. He had expected a tunnel. He found a cathedral. The space was immense, a perfectly spherical chamber at least 100 feet in diameter. The walls were not rough-hewn stone, but a smooth, seamless, polished black material that seemed to drink the lantern light. It looked like obsidian, but it held no warmth, no history. There were no tool marks, no signs of carving. It was as if the chamber had been wished into existence. The floor was just as smooth, sloping down towards the center of the sphere. And in the exact center, floating a few feet above the floor, was the source. It was a crystalline structure, roughly the size of a blacksmith's anvil, but its shape was impossible. It was a lattice of interlocking geometric forms that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them, angles and planes folding in on themselves in ways that made his mind ache. It pulsed with a faint, colorless light, a non-color that was the visual equivalent of the dissonant hum in his mind. This was what was singing the song of unmaking. This was what was teaching the iron to forget itself. "It's a shard." Elara's voice was a dry whisper, devoid of its usual authority, replaced by a note of pure ancient awe. A shard of the primal silence. The state of being before the world was given its name and its laws. Borin took an involuntary step back, his heavy hammer suddenly looking like a child's toy. His calloused hands, used to the honest heft of steel and the predictable laws of heat and stress, seemed foolish and weak in the face of this thing. Silence? It's humming like a nest of hornets in my skull. That is the sound of its nature rubbing against ours, Elara explained, never taking her eyes off the shifting crystal. It does not project force. It projects an idea, the idea of unbeing. It is a flaw in the tapestry, a thread that has come loose and now whispers to all the other threads, telling them to forget the pattern. That is what your iron heard, a song of forgetting. Kaelen understood. He felt it not as a sound, but as a pressure. His obsidian side perceived the shard's structure as a perfect, sterile absolute. A form of order so pure it denied the existence of anything else. It was the order of a blank page. His crimson eyes saw the energy it emitted, a wave of pure entropy, a command to dissolve, to return to a state of infinite, undifferentiated possibility. It was chaos disguised as peace. It was poison. The chamber grew colder. Frost began to form on the polished black floor, starting from the center and creeping outwards in delicate, complex fractals. The lantern in Kaelen's hand flickered violently, its flame turning a pale, sickly blue. "We cannot leave it here," Borin said, his voice a low growl of defiance. "It will poison the whole mountain." He hefted his hammer, a gesture of pure instinctual aggression against a thing he couldn't comprehend. "And you cannot strike it," Elara countered sharply. "Breaking it would be like shattering a bottle of plague in the middle of a city. Its song would be released all at once. The entire valley would unravel in an instant. Then what do we do?" Kaelen asked, his gaze locked on the impossible object. He felt a strange pull towards it, a resonance between the shard's sterile perfection and the absolute nature of his obsidian arm. A part of him, the cold, silent, starborn part, understood and approved of the shard's mission. The thought was terrifying. Elara turned to him, her ancient eyes reflecting the pale, colourless light. "The shard sings a song of unmaking. You must sing a louder, better song. You cannot destroy it. You must overwrite it. You are the only thing in this world that is a greater paradox than it is. It is a piece of the silence before creation. You are a piece of the heart that began it, bound to the very stone it seeks to unmake. You are the answer to its question." The exhaustion in his bones was a heavy cloak, but he knew she was right. This was his purpose. This was the first line he had to draw on his new, terrible map. He handed the dying lantern back to Borin and began to walk down the smooth, sloping floor towards the floating crystal. With each step, the dissonant hum grew louder in his mind, and the hungry cold intensified. He could feel the shard focusing on him, recognizing him as an opposing principle. It began to attack him, not with force, but with its insidious song. It didn't target his monstrous half. It targeted the man. A memory flickered in his mind. The feel of a charcoal pencil in his hand, the slightly rough texture of parchment under his palm, the satisfaction of drawing a clean, straight coastline. The memory felt thin. The details began to fade. He struggled to recall the name of the sea he had been mapping. The Caspian? The Cerulean? The name was a smudge of ink. The memory of his father's face, his proud smile, became a vague impression of warmth, the specific features blurring into nothing. His human hand, his right, began to feel distant, as if it belonged to someone else. The sensation of the cold air on his skin, the beat of his own heart, the feeling of his lungs drawing breath, all of it began to seem abstract, like concepts he had read about but never experienced. The shard was telling him that his complexity, his life, his memories were just a needless complication. It was offering him the simple, clean piece of non-existence. Kaelen! Borin's voice, rough and loud, boomed through the chamber, shattering the mental assault. The blacksmith had seen the hesitation in his step, the vacant look in his human eye. "Your name is Kaelen. Your father was a cartographer. You are here to fix my mine." The words, so simple, so grounded, were an anchor. Kaelen. The name settled back into his mind. My father. The face swam back into focus, lined with worry, but undeniably real. Borin's words were a bulwark of simple, solid reality against the shard's tide of dissolution. Kaelen locked his gaze on the crystal and pushed forward. He was 10 feet away. 5. The cold was a physical pain now, a deep ache in his human bones. He could see the frost forming on his leather tunic. He reached the center of the chamber and stood before the floating lattice of non-light. It was utterly silent here, the humming having resolved into a perfect mind-numbing emptiness. He felt his identity fraying again, the edges of his consciousness dissolving into the cold. "The Forge Boy," Borin roared, his voice echoing in the perfect sphere. "Remember the ingot, the heat and the hammer. That's real. What you did is real." "Was the ingot." Kaelen clung to the memory, the roar of the fire, the weight of the ore, the solid, satisfying ring of the hammer on true steel. He remembered the feeling of imposing order, of taking a broken thing and reminding it of its name. He had to do the same thing now. He raised his hands. He placed his left hand, the obsidian one, against the bottom of the shifting crystal. The contact was jarring. It was like two absolutes meeting. There was no give, no texture, just a perfect cold smoothness that felt like the end of all things. Through his arm, he did not try to crush the shard. He simply held it, introducing the complex, undeniable law of his own physical existence into its sterile system. He was a flaw in its perfection. Then, slowly, he brought his right hand up, the hand of crimson light. The glow was faint, weakened, but it was there. He placed it on top of the shard. If his left hand was a statement of what is, his right was a statement of what can be. It was the hand of change, of potential, of life. He closed his eyes and became the conduit between them. The shard, caught between the absolute unchanging nature of the stone and the infinite creative potential of the heart's fire, began to overload. The colourless light within it flickered violently. The mental pressure increased tenfold. A last, desperate attempt to unmake the paradox that was unmaking. Kaelen screamed, not in pain, but in sheer primal effort. He poured his own will, his own identity into the shard. He pushed the memory of the ingot, the feeling of the sun on his face, the sound of the forest, the taste of water, the complex, messy, beautiful laws of a living world into the sterile heart of the crystal. He was not destroying its song. He was adding instruments, harmonies, a new melody. He was forcing it to learn the world's music. The light within the shard began to change. The colourless void was shot through with veins of soft crimson. The perfect shifting geometry began to slow, to soften, its impossible angles resolving into smoother, more organic curves. The dissonant hum in his mind began to lower in pitch, the sour note flattening, finding a new key. The intense, hungry cold in the chamber receded, replaced by a neutral stillness. The frost on the floor melted, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The lantern flames in the tunnel entrance burned bright and yellow once more. Finally, the hum resolved into a single, low, steady tone, a note of pure, stable resonance. The light in the crystal settled, its chaotic flickering replaced by a soft, gentle, pearlescent glow. Kaelen collapsed, his strength utterly spent. He fell to his knees, his hands sliding from the now silent crystal. It remained floating, no longer a thing of menace, but an object of strange, quiet beauty. The transformation was complete. It was no longer a shard of silence. It was something else, an anchor, a tuning fork for reality. Borin and Elara rushed to his side. The blacksmith, his face pale with sweat and awe, helped Kaelen to his feet, slinging one of the warden's human arms over his broad shoulders. "Did you?" Borin started, unable to finish, gesturing at the transformed crystal. "He did not destroy it," Elara said, her voice filled with a weary wonder. She reached out a wrinkled hand, not quite touching the glowing object. "He gave it a new purpose. It is no longer broadcasting chaos. It is now holding the pattern of this place steady. The iron in this mountain will remember its name now." Kaelen leaned heavily on Borin, his vision swimming. The world felt muted and grey to his human eye, and the glow from his right side was almost entirely gone, leaving only a faint ghostly translucence. He had poured too much of himself into the crystal. given away a piece of his own fire to rekindle the worlds. He felt fragile, thin like a map drawn on brittle, time-worn paper. "This is not the only one, is it?" he rasped, the words costing him a monumental effort. Elara looked at him, her expression grim. "No, Stone Son." When the Titan's heart was silenced, it was like a great bell being struck. The vibrations of that event cracked the foundations of the world. These shards are the splinters from that cracking. They are rising from the deep places, waking up. Each one is a source of the unravelling. A new, chilling layer of understanding fell into place for Kaelen. He was a deadweight, and he knew it. Kaelen's human side, the side that understood shame and frailty, was acutely aware of the strain he was putting on Borin. The blacksmith's arm, thick as a young tree trunk, was a solid brace around his ribs, half carrying him up the sloping mine tunnel. Each jolt sent a wave of nauseating emptiness through him. The world, which had once been a symphony of data for his senses, was now a muffled, distant drone. "Easy now," Borin's voice rumbled, the sound vibrating through his own chest. "The stone is holding. You feel it, don't you?" Kaelen did. It was the only thing he felt with any clarity. On their descent, the mine had felt like a collection of fractures waiting to happen. Now, through his obsidian sense, the rock around them was content. The stress was gone. The very atoms of the stone seemed to hum with a quiet, confident integrity. The timbers he had sensed as brittle now felt solid and strong, their woody fibers properly aligned. He had healed more than the ore. He had reminded the entire mine of its own nature. Elara walked ahead, her lantern held high. She paused, running a gnarled finger along the tunnel wall. "The water that seeps here," she said, her voice echoing softly. "It runs clear. There is no red dust in it." It was true. The constant rusty trickle that had stained the mine was gone, replaced by a pure, clean drip of groundwater. The shard's influence had been a subtle, pervasive rust, and now it was gone. They emerged from the mine into the blinding light of late afternoon. Kaelen flinched, his human eye watering. The sunlight felt thin and unsubstantial. He stumbled, his legs refusing to hold him, and would have fallen if not for Borin's grip. The blacksmith grunted with the effort of holding him upright. "His fire is almost out," Borin said, a statement of fact, not of panic. He looked at Elara, his face grim in the daylight. "What now? Does he recharge?" "In a way," Elara said, her gaze on Kaelen's right hand. It was barely translucent anymore, looking more like clouded glass than living light. The crimson glow within it all but extinguished. He gave his own warmth to the cold stone. "He needs a hearth. Your forge will have to do." The journey back to Oakhaven was a blur for Kaelen. He was a passenger in his own body, his awareness flickering. He registered the solid feel of the ground, the scent of pine needles, the warmth of the sun that did little to touch the deep chill within him. He was an empty vessel, and the sounds and sensations of the living world flowed over him without finding purchase. Their arrival at the edge of the town caused an immediate stir. People stopped what they were doing, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Whispers followed them like a breeze rustling dead leaves. He was the monster from the square, the strange affliction, now returning from the hills, leaning on their smith like a wounded man. Borin ignored them all. He kept his head high, his expression daring anyone to speak a word. His grip on Kaelen was protective, proprietary. He had seen the miracle in the heart of the mountain, and the judgment of his neighbors now meant nothing to him. He marched Kaelen straight through the silent crowd, back to the sanctuary of the smithy. He deposited Kaelen on the same stone bench as before, the ambient heat of the forge a welcome relief, though it felt like trying to warm a glacier with a single candle. Borin immediately set to work, stoking the coals, his movements economical and purposeful. The rhythmic pumping of the bellows was a steady, reassuring heartbeat in the quiet forge. Elara brought Kaelen a skin of water. He drank, the cool liquid a shock to his system. It helped ground him, reminding him of the simple mechanics of being alive. "You are spread too thin, Kaelen," she said, her voice low. "You poured yourself out like water on the sand. You must learn to be a river, not a flood. Give only what is needed." "It was taking me apart," he rasped, the words scratching his throat. "My memories. It was trying to erase them." "It offered you simplicity," she corrected softly. "The primal silence is not malicious. It is merely absolute. It cannot comprehend complexity, so it seeks to undo it. Each shard you face will tempt you with a different kind of peace, a different form of surrender. You must remember why the world's messy, complicated song is worth singing." He leaned his head back against the cool stone wall, the heat from the growing fire slowly seeping into his bones. He watched Borin work, the blacksmith's movements a familiar, reassuring dance of strength and precision. He was a part of that messy song. He was a note of order and creation in the midst of chaos. Kaelen focused on the fire, on the energy it was releasing. He began to draw it in again, more carefully this time, more consciously. He felt the heat as a vibration, a chaotic dance of agitated particles. He didn't just absorb it, he filtered it, drawing in the pure energy and letting his own internal order impose itself upon it. The faint glow in his right hand began to deepen, the color slowly returning from a pale pink to a warmer rose. It was a slow, painstaking process, like gathering dew one drop at a time. Hours passed. Darkness fell outside, and Borin lit the forge lamps. He had not been idle. He had taken the ingot Kaelen had healed, and had been working it not into a blade or a tool, but into something else. The smithy was filled with the clean, ringing sound of his hammer striking true metal. When the glow in Kaelen's hand had returned to a steady, if subdued, crimson, and he could finally sit up without the world tilting, Elara spoke again. "The anchor you created in the mine. It has consequences." Kaelen looked at her. "What consequences?" "It holds the laws of this place steady. By doing so, it creates a sympathetic resonance. It is like striking a tuning fork in a room full of silent strings. The other strings that share its true note will begin to vibrate in response." She closed her eyes, her face a mask of concentration. "And I can feel them now, where before there was only a general dissonance, faint echoes. Other sources of unravelling, where?" Kaelen asked, his voice stronger now. "There is one to the east," she said, her eyes opening. "Far from here, in the marshlands of the Greyfen. It feels different. The shard in the mine attacked the laws of matter, of substance. This one feels like it is attacking the laws of life. It sings a song of decay, of stagnation." Kaelen thought of the blight that had taken his father, the creeping, unnatural decay that had consumed him. Was it connected? What is it doing? "The cycle of life and death is being broken," Elara murmured. "Things that should rot do not. Things that should grow wither. The waters are becoming still and choked. It is a slow, quiet plague, a song of perfect, unending stillness." Before Kaelen could process the implications, Borin walked over, his face streaked with soot and sweat. He held out his creation. It was a staff. It was as tall as he was, forged from the single, flawless ingot. The metal was a dark, lustrous grey, polished to a soft sheen. It was not ornate, but its lines were perfect. The base was capped with a simple heavy weight for balance, and the top was a work of art. The smith had forged the metal into an open three-pronged claw, perfectly shaped to hold a sphere. He had crafted it to hold the obsidian ball Kaelen had made at the spring. It was a weapon that was not a weapon, a tool, a walking stick, an anchor. "The world is a hard road," Borin said gruffly, pressing the staff into Kaelen's human hand. "You shouldn't walk it unsupported." Kaelen took the staff. The weight was substantial, the balance perfect. The metal felt alive in his hand, humming with the memory of its own true nature. He looked from the staff to the blacksmith's tired, honest face. It was the first true gift he had received since his transformation, a gesture of pure, unadulterated support. He reached into his pocket and produced the obsidian sphere. It was cool and smooth, a perfect globe of captured night. He fitted it into the claw at the top of the staff. It clicked into place as if it were made for it, held fast in the metal grip. The dark, polished iron of the staff and the absolute black of the sphere seemed to merge, creating a single object of profound and simple power. When he gripped the staff now, he felt a new connection. The stable, ordered nature of the healed metal flowed up his arm, a steadying influence. The sphere at the top seemed to focus his will, a lens for his perception. It felt like a part of him. "Thank you, Borin," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. The blacksmith just nodded, turning away to hide the uncharacteristic flicker of emotion in his eyes. He picked up a piece of the old brittle ore from the pile on the floor and tossed it into the revived forge. It began to glow, and Borin watched it, a craftsman considering his work. The mountain's fever might be breaking, he said to no one in particular, but it's a long way from cured. The unspoken offer hung in the air. We have more work to do. Kaelen stood, leaning on the staff. It bore his weight easily. He no longer felt like a monstrous accident. He felt like a warden, a cartographer, not of lands, but of the fraying edges of reality itself. He had a tool for his trade, a map to the next anomaly, and an ally forged in the heart of the fire. The Greyfen, a place of stagnation and decay. He had a destination. The road was indeed hard, but for the first time he felt he might be able to walk it. They left Oakhaven under a sky the colour of slate. The morning was damp and cold, and the smoke from the town's chimneys hung low in the valley, a fragile sign of the life they were leaving behind. The townsfolk watched them go, their faces visible in doorways and windows, a gallery of silent judgment and fear. No one waved, no one wished them well. They were an anomaly leaving town, a trio of the smith, the crone, and the monster. Borin seemed not to notice. He walked with a heavy, deliberate tread, his new purpose a shield against the stairs. He had entrusted his forge to his young apprentice, a lad with more enthusiasm than skill, and packed enough dried meat, hard bread, and clean water for a week. He was a man of the mountain, and the thought of the marshlands ahead was a clear weight on his mind. But he did not complain. He simply adjusted the hammer on his shoulder and marched on. As they descended from the high passes into the rolling foothills, the character of the land began to change. The clean, sharp scent of pine and cold stone gave way to the damp, loamy smell of deciduous forest. Here, the unravelling was more insidious. Kaelen, leaning on his new staff, found he could sense it more clearly now. The obsidian sphere acted, as a lens, focusing the dissonant hum of a broken world into specific, discernible points. He stopped, holding up a hand. There! He pointed with the staff towards a small, sun-dappled clearing. The light is wrong. Borin squinted. It's just a clearing, lad. No, Elara said, her eyes narrowed. He's right. Look at the shadows of the leaves on the ground. They are too sharp. They do not move. It was true. A gentle breeze was rustling the canopy above, but the dappled pattern of light and shadow on the forest floor was frozen. A perfect static photograph of a single instant. Kaelen stepped into the clearing, the staff held before him. He could feel the small temporal loop, a cousin to the one in Oakhaven Square, but weaker, less coherent. It was a stutter in the world's pulse. Remembering Elara's words, be a river, not a flood, he did not try to shatter it. He planted the base of the staff in the center of the clearing. He closed his eyes and let a trickle of the heart's power flow from his right hand, down through the iron staff and into the ground. He didn't push. He offered. He sang a quiet, steady note of linear time, a simple melody of cause and effect into the frozen moment. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a soft shimmer, like heat haze off a summer road, the shadows on the ground began to dance in time with the leaves above. The air stirred. A bee that had been hanging motionless in the air buzzed angrily and shot away. Kaelen swayed, a wave of dizziness passing over him. It was a fraction of the cost of his previous efforts. A single coin spent from his purse rather than the whole thing emptied onto the ground. He felt the drain, but also a sense of control. Borin watched him, then looked at the now normal clearing, and grunted, a sound of grudging approval. You're getting the hang of it, the blacksmith said. This is how it must be, Elara advised, joining them. You are not a warrior, Kaelen. You are a physician. You must learn to diagnose the illness and apply the precise remedy, no more, no less. Every drop of your energy is precious. They continued their journey, and for 2 days, Kaelen practiced this new methodology. He found a stream whose water had forgotten how to flow downhill, pooling in the middle of a gentle slope, and with a gentle nudge of will, reminded it of the laws of gravity. He found a flock of birds flying in a perfect repeating figure-8 pattern, and with a soft pulse of energy broke the loop and sent them scattering into the wider sky. Each act was a careful expenditure, a lesson in conservation, and with each small mending, he felt the world around them settle into a more stable, more reassuring rhythm. On the 3rd day, the ground grew soft underfoot. The great oaks and beeches gave way to weeping willows and gnarled alders. The air grew thick and heavy, clinging to their skin, and the silence changed. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of the deep woods, but a profound, expectant hush. The chirping of insects and the calls of birds had faded away, leaving only the squelch of their boots in the mud. They had reached the Greyfen. Borin's discomfort was palpable. He tested every footstep before putting his weight down, his eyes scanning the murky, tea-coloured water that pooled between clumps of tall reeds. I don't like this, he muttered, his voice a low rumble. In the mountains, the ground is honest. This just waits to swallow you. The wrongness here was of a different quality. It wasn't the sharp dissonance of the mind's shard, but a thick, cloying harmony of stillness. Kaelen could feel it as a pressure against his skin, a sluggishness in the air. He looked at a fallen log lying half submerged in the water. It should have been covered in moss and fungus, its wood soft with rot. Instead, it was perfectly preserved, its bark intact, looking as if it had fallen only yesterday, though the reeds growing around it suggested it had been there for years. Nothing was decaying. The song of stagnation, Elara whispered, her eyes taking in the unnatural preservation. The fen is holding its breath. They followed a barely their path along a ridge of slightly firmer ground, deeper into the marsh. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and vegetation, but it was a clean smell. Too clean. There was no underlying scent of decay, of the constant cycle of death and rebirth that should define such a place. It was a sterile swamp, a museum of life. It was Kaelen who saw it first. He stopped dead, his grip tightening on his staff. About 30 yards off the path, standing knee-deep in the still black water, was a great stag. Its head was raised, its magnificent antlers catching the weak, filtered sunlight. It was perfectly still. By the gods, Borin breathed, his hand going to the hammer on his shoulder. What a beast! It is not alive, Kaelen said, his voice flat. He pushed his way through the tall reeds, ignoring Borin's cautionary call. As he drew closer, the horror of the scene became clear. The stag's fur was pristine, not a hair out of place. Its powerful muscles were tensed, as if ready to bolt. But its eyes were milky, opaque orbs, and from one of them, a single perfect trail of dark viscous fluid had tracked down its face, frozen in place like a tear of black glass. There was no scent of death, no cloud of flies. It was a flawless statue of a living creature. He reached out his human hand and touched its flank. The hide was not cold with death, nor warm with life. It was room temperature, firm and leathery. It was not flesh anymore. It had been arrested in the moment of its dying, its biological processes halted so completely that decay could find no purchase. But that wasn't the worst of it. At the base of the stag's neck, a patch of its fur had sloughed away, and from the perfectly preserved flesh beneath, a cluster of pale, ghostly white fungi was growing. They were shaped like open hands, their fungal fingers reaching towards the sky. "This is the other side of the song," Elara said, coming to stand beside him. Her face was a mask of grim understanding. Where the natural cycle of decay is stopped, an unnatural one begins. The shard has not just halted death, it has created its own version of it. A life that is not life, a growth that consumes without end. Kaelen felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the fen's chill. He looked at the pale, hand-shaped fungi and was reminded of the blight, of the way it had consumed his father, preserving his form while hollowing him out from the inside. This was not just a random anomaly. This was personal. He raised his staff, the obsidian sphere seeming to drink the weak light. He focused his senses, pushing past the overwhelming lethargy of the fen. The discordant note was stronger here, clearer. He followed the thread of it, his gaze sweeping across the vast, flat expanse of water and reeds. His eyes came to rest on a shape in the distance, barely visible through the mist that was beginning to rise from the water. It was a silhouette of tumbled stone and a single skeletal structure reaching for the sky like a broken finger. A ruined bell tower. "There," he said, his voice tight. "In the old fen chapel. The heart of the stillness is there. Borin followed his gaze, his expression grim. The sunken chapel of St. Jude. They say the whole village it served slid into the marsh 100 years ago in a great flood. A place of sorrows. A place of silence, Elara corrected. And now, a place of unnatural life. It is where we must go. As she spoke, a ripple disturbed the still black water near the stag. Not a fish or a frog. Something else. A pale, hand-shaped fungus, identical to the ones on the stag's neck, broke the surface. Its fingers gently waving in a current that did not exist. Then another appeared a few feet away, and another. They were spreading, a quiet white plague moving through the stagnant water, drawn to the living warmth of the newcomers. The Greyfen had noticed them. Borin reacted as a smith reacts to flawed metal, with a hammer. He took a half-step forward, his boots sinking into the soft mud, and swung his heavy mallet in a clean, powerful arc. The hammerhead connected with the nearest of the pale, reaching hands. There was no satisfying crunch. The fungus dissolved on impact into a cloud of fine white powder that billowed into the thick air. The effect was immediate and sickening. Kaelen felt a wave of profound lethargy wash over him, a physical weight that settled deep in his bones. His thoughts slowed, the edges of his perception blurring. The will to move, to even stand, began to evaporate. It was the Shard's song, concentrated and weaponized, a poison of pure apathy. Beside him, Borin staggered back, a low groan rumbling in his chest. "My arm," he grunted, his voice suddenly sluggish. "It feels like it's full of lead." He tried to lift the hammer again, and the effort was immense, his powerful muscles straining as if he were trying to lift an anvil. "Don't breathe it in," Elara snapped, pulling the collar of her robe over her nose and mouth. "And don't strike them again, you fool! You are just scattering the seeds of its stillness." Kaelen fought against the encroaching emptiness. He planted the base of his staff firmly into the mud, the solid iron a conduit to the more stable earth beneath. He focused on the memory of the forge, the vibrant, chaotic energy of the fire, the opposite of this creeping void. He let a pulse of that memory, that energy, flow from his right hand into the staff. A faint crimson light emanated from the sphere at its tip, cutting through the gloom. The wave of lethargy receded from him, pushed back by the assertion of his own will. The fungi nearest to him seemed to shrink from the light, their pale fingers curling inward slightly. The path was clear. Brute force was useless. They had to push back the stillness with a stronger assertion of life. "Borin, Elara, stay close to me," Kaelen commanded, his voice gaining strength as he focused his intent. Behind the staff, he took a hesitant step forward, pushing the staff ahead of him like a torch in a dark room. The crimson glow from the sphere intensified, creating a small pocket of reality around them, perhaps 10 feet across. Inside this bubble, the air felt lighter. The oppressive silence lessened. Outside it, the pale hands continued to break the surface of the water. A silent, waiting army. They had to walk through a field of them to reach the chapel. Borin, his movements still heavy but no longer impossible, fell in behind Kaelen, his hammer held at the ready. Elara walked beside him, her keen eyes scanning their surroundings. The journey was agonizingly slow. Kaelen had to maintain constant focus, feeding a steady stream of energy into the staff. It was a delicate balance. Too little, and the Fen's influence would overwhelm them. Too much, and he would exhaust himself before they reached their destination. He was walking a razor's edge, the drain a constant, pulling ache in his core. The pale hands in the water seemed to track their progress, their strange finger-like appendages turning to follow the light. They did not try to enter the bubble of normalcy Kaelen projected, but they crowded its edges, a silent pale throng that seemed to whisper of the sweet, thoughtless peace of surrender. It took them the better part of an hour to cross the 300 yards to the sunken chapel. By the time they reached the small island of solid ground on which the ruins stood, Kaelen was trembling with exertion, his human face slick with sweat despite the fen's chill. The glow from his staff faded as he leaned on it, his energy reserves perilously low. The chapel was a skeleton of stone and sorrow. Most of the nave had collapsed into the marsh, leaving only a few jagged walls standing like broken teeth. The bell tower, however, was mostly intact, a leaning finger of grey stone pointing accusingly at the overcast sky. The entire structure was draped in thick, unnaturally green ivy, its leaves waxy and perfect, showing no signs of age or insect damage. The song of stagnation was a palpable thrum here, a bass note that vibrated in Kaelen's bones. "The main doors are long gone," Borin observed, his voice regaining its normal timbre as they stepped out of the immediate influence of the fungal field. He pointed to a low, arched opening in the base of the tower, half choked with rubble, and the same unnaturally perfect ivy. That was the entrance to the crypt. It might lead up into the chancel. With renewed purpose, the blacksmith went to work. His hammer, no longer a useless weapon, became a tool again. He smashed through the smaller rocks and tore at the thick, rubbery ivy with his bare hands, his strength a welcome grounding reality in this place of creeping strangeness. Within minutes, he had cleared an opening large enough for them to crawl through. He lit a lantern, its warm yellow flame a defiant spark against the chapel's gloom. He ducked inside first, and Kaelen and Elara followed him into the oppressive dark. They were in a small, stone-walled crypt. Empty sarcophagi lined the walls, their lids askew. A set of stone stairs, slick with damp, led upwards. The air was cold, still, and utterly devoid of the usual scent of dust and decay. It smelled of nothing, a sterile void. As they ascended the stairs, the low, resonant hum of the shard grew stronger. It wasn't just in Kaelen's mind now. Borin felt it as a pressure in his ears, and Elara as a fine tremor in the stone floor. They emerged into what was left of the chapel's main chamber. The roof was gone, open to the grey sky. The floor was a treacherous mosaic of cracked flagstones and pools of black, stagnant water. At the far end, on a raised dais, stood the altar, and on the altar lay the source. It was not floating freely like the shard in the mine. This one, a milky quartz-like crystal the size of a human heart, was embedded in the chest of a human body. The body was that of a priest, dressed in the rotting remnants of once fine vestments. He was perfectly preserved, his skin waxy and pale, his lips drawn back in a serene, horrifying smile. His hands were folded on his chest, cradling the shard as it pulsed with a soft white light. But the true horror was what emanated from him, from the priest's body, a vast, intricate network of thick, white, cord-like mycelium spread out across the altar, down the dais and across the chapel floor, plunging into the dark water and spreading out into the fen. The pale, hand-shaped fungi were not individual organisms. They were the sensory organs of this one, vast central creature, with the dead priest and the shard as its heart. Kaelen stared, a cold, familiar sickness rising in his throat. The waxy, preserved skin of the priest, the unnatural growth sprouting from it. It was his father's death writ large, transformed from a personal tragedy into a landscape of horror. This was the Blight's origin. This was the song that had lured his father into stillness. "St. Jude," Elara breathed, her voice a horrified whisper. "The shard did not just land here. It found a host. It has merged with the sorrow and the memory of this place." As they watched, a slow, deliberate tremor ran through the mycelial network. The priest's head turned on the altar. A smooth, unnatural movement. His milky, unseeing eyes fixed upon them. The serene smile on his face did not change, but the hum of the shard intensified, and a new thought pushed into Kaelen's mind. A soft, seductive whisper that was not a sound, but a feeling. "Rest, the struggle is over. Be still and be preserved. Join the perfect, unchanging peace." The priest on the altar slowly began to sit up, the shard in his chest glowing brighter. The thick white cords of the mycelium tightened, pulling him upright like a macabre puppet. The song of stagnation was no longer a passive broadcast. It now had a conductor. Borin let out a choked cry, not of fear, but of sheer physical oppression. He dropped to one knee, his hammer clattering on the flagstones. The psychic whisper was a siren song tailored to his soul. It showed him a forge, perfectly clean. Its fire banked in a perpetual gentle glow. It showed him a finished blade on the anvil, a masterwork of impossible perfection that would never dull, never rust, never need sharpening. The final ultimate act of creation, with an eternity of rest to follow. Why lift the hammer again when the best work was already done? Elara too was affected. She braced herself against a crumbling wall, her face pale, her breath coming in shallow rasps. For her, the whisper was of a library, silent and still, containing all the world's knowledge bound in ageless leather. No more prophecies to interpret, no more grim futures to witness. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing, with no burden to act. The puppet priest took a step forward, sliding off the altar with a dry, rustling sound. The mycelial cords stretched and pulsed, a grotesque umbilical network connecting it to the entire fen. The temptation intensified, a suffocating blanket of peace. Kaelen felt it most keenly of all. The whisper delved into his deepest wound, showing him his father's study. He could smell the dry paper, the ink, the clove-scented pipe tobacco. His father was there, not as a withered husk, but whole and healthy, smiling at him over a half-finished map. "It doesn't have to hurt, son," the false memory whispered. "Here, nothing ever changes. No one ever leaves. We can be preserved just like this forever." His obsidian arm felt like a foreign weight. His crimson hand felt like a fever. The offer to simply lay down the burden, to be just Kaelen the cartographer's boy again, was an agony of desire. No, he bit his tongue, the sharp tang of blood a spike of reality. He drove the base of his staff into the stone floor, and the impact jarred him, clearing his head for a precious instant. It's a lie, a beautiful, perfect lie. He poured his will into the staff, not a trickle this time, but a defiant flood. A brilliant crimson dome of light erupted from the obsidian sphere, washing over them. The psychic pressure lessened, the false visions flickering and dissolving like smoke. Borin gasped, shaking his head as if waking from a dream, and snatched his hammer from the floor. Elara straightened up, her eyes hard and clear. "It feeds on despair," she said, her voice sharp. "It is powered by the priest's final, hopeless prayer. A prayer for an end to suffering answered by this abomination." As if in response to their defiance, the mycelial network came alive. Cords as thick as a man's arm, pale and bloodless, shot out from the walls and the dark pools of water. They moved with a silent serpentine speed, converging on the small island of light Kaelen had created. Kaelen held his ground, the staff a bastion against the tide. The crimson light sizzled where the cords touched it, and the tendrils recoiled. But more came, a relentless, silent assault. It was taking all his concentration just to maintain the shield. Borin, seeing Kaelen locked in a stationary battle of wills, looked around wildly. He couldn't strike the priest, who stood just beyond the reach of his hammer, calmly directing the assault. He couldn't strike the cords, lest he release more of the soporific spores. He was a creature of force and impact in a battle that had no clear target. His eyes fell to the floor, to the thick white veins of the network running through the cracks in the flagstones. A fierce, desperate grin split his soot-stained face. "If I can't kill the spider," he roared, swinging his hammer not at the creature, but at the ground at his feet, "I can still tear up its web." The 12-pound hammer struck the ancient stone with a deafening crack. The flagstone shattered, disrupting the path of a dozen cords. They writhed, their connection broken, before burrowing into the earth to find a new route. Borin didn't wait. He became a force of chaos, of disruption. He moved around the perimeter of Kaelen's shield, smashing the floor, bringing down chunks of the crumbling walls, his every blow a percussive declaration of war against stillness. He was not destroying the enemy, but he was forcing it to constantly mend its own body, diverting its focus from the psychic assault. The tactic worked. The pressure in Kaelen's mind eased, allowing him to think beyond simple defense. He looked at the priest, at the serene, smiling face, and at the shard pulsing with cold, white light in its chest. Elara's words echoed in his mind. It found a hook in his sorrow. He wasn't just fighting a shard. He was fighting the ghost of a man whose grief had become a cage for himself and a plague for the world. He couldn't simply overwrite the shard's song of stillness. He had to resolve the sorrow that gave it an anchor. He had to heal the man, to disarm the crystal. "Elara," he grunted, the strain of maintaining the shield evident in his voice. His name was Jude. St. Jude of the Fen, she confirmed, her eyes fixed on the priest. Patron of lost causes. He stayed behind when the village was evacuated, refusing to abandon his chapel. He drowned with it, praying as the waters rose. A lost cause. A prayer of despair. Kaelen understood. He had to offer Jude's ghost a different answer to his prayer. He changed his focus. The crimson light of his shield softened, the hard, defiant edge giving way to a warmer, more compassionate glow. He stopped pushing a song of life and defiance. Instead, he began to project a different idea, a different memory. He thought of the forest floor after a rain, of the rich, dark smell of fallen leaves turning to soil. He thought of the cycle of seasons in Oakhaven, the hardship of winter giving way to the promise of spring. He thought of his own father, not the static, preserved image the shard had offered, but the real man. He remembered his father's hands, stained with ink but strong, the pride in his eyes at a well-drawn map, and the quiet acceptance on his face in his final days. He projected the truth that all things, even love, even grief, must change and flow, that an ending was not a failure, but a necessary part of the pattern. He aimed this new song not at the shard, but at the waxy preserved heart of the man it inhabited. The effect was profound. The serene smile on the priest's face faltered. The corners of his mouth trembled. A flicker of profound confusion crossed his pale features. The mycelial network slowed its assault, the cords wavering as if uncertain of their purpose. Borin, sensing the shift, paused his hammering, his broad chest heaving. The priest, Jude, raised a hand. It was a slow, creaking movement, but it was his own. It was not the fluid, controlled motion of the puppet master, but the hesitant gesture of a man waking from a long dream. The hand did not reach for them in attack. It reached for the shard in its own chest. The shard reacted violently. A pulse of brilliant, sterile white light flared from it, and the priest cried out. A thin, reedy sound, the first noise he had made, a sound of pure agony. The mycelial chords thrashed, and the psychic pressure returned, no longer a seductive whisper, but a shriek of cold, absolute command. Be still, ye. Kaelen staggered, the focused assault nearly buckling his knees. He saw what was happening. It was a battle for the soul of the host. He had given Jude's spirit a reason to fight back, and the shard was now trying to crush its vessel's burgeoning rebellion. Borin, the altar, Kaelen yelled, pouring every last ounce of his remaining strength into reinforcing his shield. Break his throne. The blacksmith didn't need to be told twice. He saw the dais, the stone altar from which the entire network seemed to originate. With a roar he charged. He leapt over a writhing nest of cords, his heavy boots finding purchase on the first step of the dais. He swung his hammer at the stone slab, the resting place of the priest. The first blow sent a spiderweb of cracks across the ancient water-stained marble. The second shattered a large chunk from the corner. The entire mycelial network convulsed in agony, and the priest stumbled back, his hand falling from the shard. Kaelen saw his chance. The shard's connection to the wider fen was damaged, its power base disrupted. Now, he had to sever its connection to the host. He dropped his shield, letting the crimson light collapse back into the staff, and charged forward, following in Borin's wake. The remaining cords on the dais lashed at him, but he batted them aside with the iron staff. He reached the stumbling priest just as Borin landed a third, devastating blow that split the altar in two. He stood before the animated corpse of St. Jude. Up close, he could see the tracks of ancient dried tears on the man's waxy cheeks. He looked into the milky eyes and spoke, not to the shard, but to the man. Your cause is not lost, Jude, Kaelen said, his voice ringing with a conviction he didn't know he possessed. Your prayer is answered. Let the waters recede. Let the cycle turn. Rest. He reached out, not with his crimson hand of life, but with his left hand, the hand of cold, hard, obsidian reality. He did not try to pull the shard out. He simply laid his crystalline fingers on the dead flesh surrounding the crystal. He did not channel fire or life. He channeled order, the pure, simple, physical law of the mountain. He reminded the dead flesh of its true nature. He told it that it was dead, that its time was over. He commanded it to obey the most fundamental law of all. The flesh beneath his fingers began to change. The waxy, preserved quality gave way. The skin darkened, dried, and began to flake away, turning to dust and ash, the decay of a century happening in a single second. The process was shockingly fast. The command for decay was absolute, a law reintroduced to a place that had forgotten it. The priest's skin, waxy and pale, turned grey, then black. It cracked like dried riverbed mud, then sloughed away as fine dark dust, revealing blackened bone beneath. The remnants of his vestments, held together by the shard's unnatural preservation, crumbled into limp, damp threads. Within seconds, all that was left of St. Jude on the shattered altar was a clean skeleton, which then collapsed into a heap of bone and dust, as a century of entropy asserted itself in a single, silent rush. As its host dissolved, the shard of milky quartz fell from the collapsed ribcage, clattering onto the broken marble with a sound like a dropped stone. Freed from its anchor of sorrow, Its passive song of stagnation ended, and its true nature flared. A wave of pure absolute stillness radiated from it, and the very air in the chapel seemed to congeal. The motes of dust from the priest's remains froze in mid-air. The water in the pools on the floor became instantly motionless, their surfaces as smooth and reflective as black glass. Simultaneously, the vast mycelial network suffered a catastrophic failure. The thick white cords convulsed, then rapidly lost their strange pale vitality. They shriveled, turning from white to a sickly grey, then to black, collapsing into a fine greasy soot that settled on every surface. Outside the chapel, a great sigh seemed to pass through the Greyfen. The millions of pale hand-shaped fungi dissolved in unison, turning the stagnant water cloudy with their remains for a brief moment before they settled into the mud. For the first time in a century, a breeze stirred the air in the chapel, carrying with it a scent that was shocking in its normalcy. The rich, damp, complex smell of rot. The cycle had been restarted. Kaelen stood panting before the pile of dust and bone, his obsidian arm still outstretched. He felt the shard's new projection not as a temptation, but as a raw, physical force. It was trying to stop the atoms in his body from vibrating, to freeze the electrical signals in his nerves. It was a command for a perfect and final end to all processes. He lowered his arm and stepped forward. Borin started to protest. "Lad, don't!" But Elara put a hand on the blacksmith's arm. "Let him. This is his work." Kaelen knelt beside the fallen shard. He did not touch it with his crimson hand of life, nor his obsidian hand of physical law. He looked at it, this crystal heart of absolute stillness, and he understood what he had to do. He had learned from his first two encounters. The shard in the mine needed a new purpose. The shard in the fen needed an ending. He could not overwrite its nature. Its nature was the end. So he would give it what it wanted. He reached out his human hand, the hand of a cartographer, a hand that understood boundaries and definitions. He held it just above the crystal, and from his right side he channeled not a flood of life, but a single, precise concept. Conclusion. He projected the idea of a story that has been told, a song that has been sung, a journey that has reached its destination. He did not fight the shard's nature. He fulfilled it. He took its endless droning note of finality and gave it a final, resonant chord. The milky, internal light of the shard flared brightly for one moment, a flash of pure, sterile white, and then it went out. The crystal did not vanish or shatter. It simply became a rock, a piece of milky quartz, cold to the touch, holding no power, broadcasting no song. Its purpose fulfilled, it had become inert, a silent monument to its own conclusion. The last of the oppressive weight lifted from the chapel. Kaelen felt the world rush back in. The sound of Borin's heavy breathing, the drip of water from the crumbling walls, the distant cry of a marsh bird, the first to break the long silence. He swayed, the accumulated exhaustion of the fight crashing down on him. Borin was at his side in an instant, his big hand steadying him. "Easy, Kaelen. It's over." Kaelen leaned against the smith, looking at the place where a man had been a prisoner for 100 years. A sense of profound, weary sadness washed over him. He had fought a monster, but he had also laid a ghost to rest. He thought of his father, of the Blight. He had not vanquished the memory of his father's death, but he had given it a context, a meaning. It was not a random fading, but a small part of a vast cosmic struggle. The knowledge was a cold comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. "He's at peace now," Elara said softly, her gaze on the pile of bone dust. "Both of them." She walked over and picked up the inert shard. It was just a stone in her hand. "The world is a tapestry, Kaelen. You are not reweaving it, but mending the broken threads one by one. This one is mended." They made their way out of the ruined chapel, back into the Greyfen. The transformation was breathtaking. The water, no longer still, flowed in slow, lazy currents. Insects hummed in the air, their buzzing a vibrant chorus. The waxy, perfect leaves of the ivy on the chapel walls were already beginning to show the first signs of natural decay, a slight yellowing at their edges. The fen had begun to breathe again. They found a patch of dry land away from the ruins and made a small, cheerless camp. Borin, ever practical, produced dried meat and a skin of water, forcing Kaelen to eat and drink. The food tasted bland, but it anchored him to the living world. The drain on him had been different this time, less a hollowing out of his fire and more a deep mental weariness, as if he had just finished a complex equation that had taken him days to solve. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, Elara sat staring into the small campfire they had built. "The resonance has changed again," she said, her voice distant. "When you calmed the first shard, it was like a single clear note that caused the others to hum in sympathy. Now, with two anchors in place, it is more than a hum. It is a chord. I can feel the dissonance of the other threads more clearly against its harmony." Kaelen looked up from where he was resting against his staff. "You found another one?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said, turning to face him, her ancient eyes reflecting the firelight. "And it is unlike the others. The first attacked the stone, the second the flesh. This next one, it attacks the bonds between people. It sings a song of isolation." Borin paused, a piece of dried meat halfway to his mouth. "What does that mean?" "It means it is a plague of the soul," Elara explained, her expression grim. "It whispers in crowded rooms, making a friend's face seem like a stranger's mask. It twists earnest words into lies in the ears of the listener. It fosters suspicion, erodes trust, and turns neighbors into enemies. It teaches the single, simple, terrible law that you are, and always will be, alone." A chill far colder than the marsh air settled over Kaelen. He had faced the unmaking of matter and the corruption of life. But this was a subtler, more human poison. How could he fight a thing that lived in a glance, in a misunderstood word? "Where is it?" he asked, his voice low. "In a place where such a plague would be most devastating," Elara replied. "In the great port city of Silvergate, a hub of trade and talk, a city built on contracts and promises, on the trust between 1,000 different peoples. Or at least it was. Now I feel it curdling. The city's song is becoming a discordant clatter of locked doors and suspicious whispers." Borin swore under his breath. "A city, full of guards and guilds and suspicious greybeards who don't like strangers. We can't just march in there with a hammer and a glowing staff." "No," Kaelen agreed, his mind already turning over the new, complex problem. His power was to mend the fundamental laws of reality. But how could he use it when the battlefield was the human heart itself? "This is not a monster in a cave or a ghost in a swamp. This is a sickness we cannot even see." "But they will see you," Elara pointed out, her gaze falling on his mismatched form. "In the wilderness you are a strange wonder. In a city you are a monster to be feared or a commodity to be exploited. The Shard's song of isolation will find fertile ground in the fear you create just by walking down the street." He looked down at his hands. The crimson glow of his right hand was steady, a warm, reassuring presence. His left hand, the obsidian one, rested on the iron staff, a thing of absolute unyielding strength. He was a paradox, a walking contradiction, and now he had to take that contradiction into the heart of a city that was forgetting how to trust. He stood up, the weariness still clinging to him, but his resolve hardening. Then we learn a new way to fight. He looked out over the now living marsh, a small piece of the world he had helped to heal. It was a start. We go to Silvergate. The journey to Silvergate took them through civilized lands for the first time. They travelled on roads rutted by merchant carts and patrolled by bored-looking soldiers from local baronies. Here, Kaelen's form was a liability. He took to travelling at night, or wearing a heavy cowled cloak and gloves that hid his nature, though the stifling fabric felt like a shroud. Borin did the talking. His gruff honesty, a disarming counter to the suspicion that seemed to grow thicker in the air the closer they got to the coast. They saw the city first from a high ridge at dawn, a sprawling confusion of slate roofs and stone towers clustered around a magnificent natural harbour. But even from a distance, something was wrong. The harbour, which should have been a forest of masts and bustling with the traffic of 100 ships, held only a few dozen vessels, riding at anchor in eerie silence. No flotilla of small lighters and tenders moved between them and the shore. No plume of smoke rose from the forges in the artisans' district. Silvergate was a city holding its breath. Entering was easier and harder than they'd expected. The gate guards were sullen and sharp-eyed, but their suspicion was a general malady, directed at everyone. They took Borin's coin and waved them through with apathetic disinterest, too consumed by the distrust of their fellow guards to properly interrogate a new arrival. The sickness Elara had described was everywhere. It was in the way a baker snatched a coin from a customer without meeting their eyes. It was in the shuttered windows of the grand trading houses along the wharf. It was in the silence of the taverns, where patrons drank alone, their backs to each other. It was a city of 100,000 people, each stranded on their own private island. Borin's attempt to find them lodgings was a grim exercise in this new reality. Innkeepers quoted outrageous prices, accusing him of trying to swindle them when he balked. One even refused them a room, his eyes flicking to Kaelen's cloaked form, muttering about vagabonds and ill omens. They finally found a room in a dilapidated boarding house, run by a woman so lost in her own bitter memories, she barely registered their presence. "This is impossible," Borin fumed that night, pacing the small, dusty room. "How do you fight this? There's no monster to smash. The whole city is the monster." "It has a heart," Kaelen said from the shadows in the corner, where he sat with his staff across his knees. "I can feel it, but it's not a single note like the others. It's a knot of tangled threads. The fear and suspicion of every soul in this city feeds it, and it feeds them in return." For 2 days, they tried to unravel that knot. Borin, a master of his guild, sought out the smith's quarter, hoping to find a common language in the craft. He found only locked forges and men who stared at him as if he were a thief, their hammers held like weapons. Elara walked the markets, listening, but heard only the venomous whispers of gossip and accusation. It was Kaelen who found the path. Cloaked and hooded, he walked the city after midnight, when the streets were empty and the psychic noise had subsided to a dull hum of resentful dreams. He used his staff not as a torch, but as a dowsing rod, feeling for the source of the cold, hard certainty that lay beneath the chaos of mistrust. He followed it through the winding alleys of the merchant's quarter, past the silent shipyards, up the grand boulevards of the noble district, until he stood before a single stark structure that rose from the city's heart, the magistrate's spire. It was a tower of black basalt, sleek and severe, a monument to law and judgment. The song of isolation was a trumpet blast here, a declaration of absolute solitary truth. "It is in the spire," he told the others the next morning. "In the place meant to bind people together with law, it is tearing them apart." Getting in was a challenge. The spire was manned by the city watch, men and women whose innate suspicion was now honed to a razor's edge by the Shard's influence. But that same influence was their weakness. The guards did not trust each other. They did not coordinate. A distraction at the south gate. A fire started by Borin with a flask of oil and a tinderbox drew the bulk of the force, each officer suspecting the others of incompetence or treachery. In the confusion, Kaelen and Elara slipped through a service entrance on the north side. The interior of the spire was cold and silent. The great hall of pleas was empty, its benches thick with dust. They climbed the central staircase, the cold, lonely hum growing with every step, until they reached the top floor, the magistrate's private chambers. The door was unlocked. Inside, the room was Spartan, furnished only with a heavy desk, a single chair, and shelves overflowing with scrolls of city law. A man stood by the grand window, his back to them, looking down on the paralyzed city. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in the severe black robes of his office. "I have been expecting you," the magistrate said, his voice as dry as rustling paper. He turned and Kaelen felt a jolt. The man's eyes were the color of a winter sky, and in their depths was a chilling, absolute clarity. There was no visible shard, no unnatural growth. The power was inside him, fully integrated, looking out through his eyes. This was no puppet. This was a willing host. "I am the cure," the magistrate corrected, a faint condescending smile on his thin lips. "But I offer this city the one perfect, unassailable truth. You can only trust yourself. All else is a lie. Love, loyalty, friendship. They are merely contracts of convenience, waiting to be broken. I am simply removing the delusion." He focused his gaze on Borin, who had just come lumbering up the final stairs. "Blacksmith, your warden is a tool. Once he has fixed this broken world for the old woman, what use will they have for a monster? They will cast you aside. You know this." Borin grunted, his hand tightening on his hammer, his eyes flicking towards Kaelen with a flicker of doubt. The seed had been planted. The magistrate then looked at Elara. "Seer, you have spent a lifetime watching the world burn. You finally have the weapon you need to put out the fire. But what happens when the weapon grows a will of its own? He is a power far beyond your control. He must be managed. For the greater good, of course." Elara's face became a mask, her expression unreadable, calculating. Finally, the magistrate's cold gaze fell on Kaelen. "And you, the broken boy, you think they are your friends? One is a simple man who fears your monstrous half. The other is a schemer who covets your power. They walk with you not out of loyalty, but out of need. When their need is met, you will be alone. It is your nature. It is the truth of all things. Embrace it." The words were a poisoned dart, aimed directly at the wound of Kaelen's own deepest fears. He felt a chasm open between him and his companions. He saw the flicker of doubt in Borin's eyes, the cold calculation in Elara's. The shard wasn't just broadcasting a general feeling, it was using the magistrate's intimate knowledge of law, and human failing to craft perfect individual lies. He staggered back, his staff feeling heavy and useless. The crimson light in his right hand dimmed. The world was a lie. Connection was a lie. He was alone. But then a memory surfaced. Not one the magistrate could twist, for it was not made of words or promises. It was the memory of Borin's hand on his shoulder in the dark of the mine. The memory of the smith's gruff pride as he presented him with the staff. A gift freely given, expecting nothing in return. It was the memory of Elara's steady voice guiding him, teaching him to be a river, not a flood. These things were not lies. They were actions. They were real. No, Kaelen whispered, and the word was a shield. He looked at Borin, not at the doubt in his eyes, but at the calloused hand that had held him up. He looked at Elara, not at her calculation, but at the weary wisdom that had lit his path. You are wrong. He raised his staff, planting it on the floor of the spire. The world is not a collection of broken contracts. It's a tapestry. That's what you told me, Elara. And a tapestry is not a single thread. It's made of 1,000 threads, crossing and connecting. The pattern is the connection. He slammed the base of the staff down. A shockwave, not of sound, but of pure will, emanated from it. The magistrate stumbled back, his cold certainty momentarily shattered. Kaelen knew what he had to do. He could not destroy this shard without killing the man. He could not heal it, for its sickness was a philosophy. He had to build something stronger beside it. He had created an anchor of physical stability, and an anchor for the cycle of life. Now he would create a third. He held his 2 hands out on either side of the obsidian sphere atop his staff. His left hand, the hand of obsidian, of absolute unchanging reality. His right hand, the crimson hand of life, of infinite creative potential. They did not understand with their minds, but with their hearts. Borin thought of his forge, of the trust between smith and steel, and pushed that feeling of certainty towards Kaelen. Elara thought of the great tapestry of the world, of the connections she had spent a lifetime tracing, and offered that pattern to him. Kaelen became the conduit. He drew their strength, their belief, and added his own. He poured the memory of every connection he had ever witnessed. His father's love, the smith's friendship, the seer's guidance into the crucible of his being. He wasn't fating the shard's song. He was composing a harmony. The obsidian sphere at the top of his staff began to glow, not with crimson light, but with a soft, brilliant gold. The spire, the tallest point in the city, became a broadcasting tower.